Welcome to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and I'll be your host for tonight's valuable program. Here at Standing for Truth, we exist to uphold the truth of biblical creation and engage claims of deep time with clarity, conviction, and evidence. Tonight, we're tackling one of the biggest questions in origins and geology. Was the Genesis flood real history? Joining me live is young Earth creation geologist, Dr. Tim Clarey from the Institute for Creation Research. Together, we'll take a hard look at the rock record, the large-scale geological patterns we observe worldwide, and the flood evidence that challenges the deep time narrative and powerfully confirms the biblical account. So get ready, because this is going to be eye-opening, highly informative, and packed with evidence that you don't want to miss. Dr. Clarey, it's a privilege to have you here, brother. Welcome to Standing for Truth.
Oh, it's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I'm looking forward to this. I've got one of your books behind me, carved in stone. Excellent book, gorgeous book. I love the material, the pictures in there. You put a lot of work into that, clearly. So God bless you for what you're doing.
Oh, however, it's our book, the people that do the books and our communications staff or editors, they did a wonderful job putting it together. So I can't take the credit for how well the book looks, but I contribute a lot of the information. Let's put it that way.
Good. Well, it's a team effort, and your team did a great job. Dr. Clarey, before we get into some of your slides and presentation to help set the foundation for what we are going to be discussing here this evening, I do want to give you a formal introduction for anybody who might be unfamiliar with who you are. And so Dr. Tim Clarey earned an MS in geology from the University of Wyoming, 1984, an MS in hydrogeology, and a PhD in geology in 1996, both from Western Michigan University. He worked as an exploration geologist with Chevron USA from 1984 to 1992, and later served as full professor and chair of geosciences at Delta College in Michigan, very close to where I am, Tim, for 17 years. In 2013, he joined the science staff at the Institute for Creation Research after also participating in ICR's FAST program. He has published numerous papers, especially on the Rocky Mountains, authored 2 college lab books, and he and his wife, Renee, co-authored the Children's Henry series. Dr. Clarey, again, I appreciate you giving us your time for today's program. Let's hand it to you and set the foundation with some slides and some information on today's topic.
Okay, great. Thanks. It's my pleasure. I'm going to kind of cut into one of my normal PowerPoint talks a little bit into it, just kind of cut to the chase, as they say, and try to make this a little more brief. And so we have time for you to interact and ask questions, and the audience people may have, I don't know if they can chat or not. But we're going to talk a lot about the flood. And, people ask me all the time, where's the evidence for the flood? And I tell people, look down. If you just look down, most people are standing on thousands of feet of sedimentary rock filled with fossils that were deposited in the flood. And so you're standing on. Now, if you go further north in Canada, of course, the sediments disappear and you're just looking at the basement. But in most places where most people in the world live, they live on sedimentary rocks that are deposited by the flood. So the evidence is right there below your feet. So let me talk about some of that evidence as I go through my screen share here. And we'll see if this works. Conventional scientists, if you study geology, they'll talk about, they actually believe in floods. They just don't think the whole world flooded. And so they would go with this particular flood event. They would say that, well, there was an early flood that flooded this much of North America. This is North America, if you can't see the outlines. This second flood, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. And so they believe in 6 different floods. They call these mega sequences. Now, they used to be called sequences. In the 1960s, there was a geologist in, I think from Wisconsin, Lawrence Sloss, came up with this idea that really what we're seeing in the rock record is a series of floods that flooded the continents. And he started in North America, so he used a lot of North American native tribes. So you get names like the Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, Serica, Zunia, Tejas. But those you can see on the graph here, they relate to the other names that we're more familiar with, like the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian. But generally, these flood sequences include several of those. or parts of some of those. And so there's really 6 sequences that 6 different advances of water across the continents, and then 6 or 5 retreats of those, including the final one. And this is the standard. In the middle, there's a standard sea level curve that evolutionary scientists will put forth in all the books. And the way that kind of works in the middle is if it goes to the left, it's higher sea level. So that the line down the middle, the very middle of that graph shows today's sea level. And then in the past, they believe it went higher. And then it came back down in sequence 4 there, the observatory, and then went way back up again in sequence 5, which I kind of agree with that one, but I don't agree with the lowermost one. I gave a talk on this a while back. But here's what you really see when you look at the rocks piling on top of each other in the world. You see the different sequences piling in, and then you see a big advance of the sediments at a certain level. And then you see the most coverage late, actually in sequence number 5. I can run through that again if I go back, but I'm going to keep it moving. So what you see and what they show are 2 different things. And so what I'm seeing is sea levels that slowly work their way up, a little bit of an advance, and then drops, a little bit more of an advance, it drops, and a little bit of advance. But the first 3 sequences really don't flood a whole lot of the earth, as that graph just showed. And so I've been studying the continents all over the world, and eventually you get to the point where things started getting higher and higher with lots of fluctuations in between. And this is my sea level curve that I drew to really show what the data show. And so I'm trying to follow the data, and this is what I show. And you can compare that. We'll compare that to what the evolutionary curve showed. They showed a real high peak in those early sequences, the Salk and Tippecanoe, whereas I don't really see that. I see just lower. So you can put them side by side. You can see my curve on the right, the evolutionary curve in most textbooks on the left. And there's a big difference in those numbered 1, 2, and 3 sequences, those early sequences, which I believe was all part of the 1-year flood. They believe, of course, these sequences are separated by millions of years in between as well. But as we'll see, there's no evidence for that. There's just layer upon layer like pancakes on top of each other. So I think there's just one big progressive flood that took place, and that's what the rock data show. And I'll go through that again from my 7 continents now. I just finished, last week I just finished Antarctica, so we're still processing the data. But I'm going to be showing you 6 continents worth of data today. Sometimes the graph will only show 5 because some of the we're kind of in transition to get final graphics. But basically I have 6 continents worth of data with about 3,300 columns that I've compiled all over the earth. And let's talk about those a bit. What I've been doing is looking for oil wells, which I used to do for oil and gas companies. Now I have to find them online. Data, offshore, onshore. Basically what I've gathered around the world is every uplift, every major uplift, every mountain range, several places on mountain ranges, several places in the basins in between, every country, every continent, every province, every state. I've got data that I can put in. Even in Ontario, there's quite a bit of data as you go around. And so there's a lot of oil wells that were drilled, especially, southern Ontario, looking for oil. And so I was able to access a lot of these and put them in. And so I've got over 3,000 columns worldwide, including Australia. And now I've got 100 and some columns around Antarctica, what I could find. And so each one of these columns is really like drilling a well if you drilled all the way down to the crust. And so here in Texas, we drill through 15,000 feet, 20,000 feet of sediment sometimes to get down to the crust of the earth, and that's where we stop. So these are the sediments. These are what's the rocks that are still there today. So this is, people say they love my data because it's real. It's the real wells, the drilled offshore, the deep water wells, and all these places, the real rocks on shore where they've measured up like mountain ranges, etc. It's the real rocks that are there today. And so I don't think anybody but myself and my colleague here who helped me throughout this whole process, we're the only ones, I think, looking at the whole world, taking a whole look at the world, what rocks there today, especially with all the new drilling offshore in the deep water where you're looking at things in, 300 meters or, 3,000 meters almost. They're drilling in ridiculously deep water now, over 10,000 feet in places. And some of that data is really helping me really tie this all together. So we're looking at, data on the continents and offshore on the shallow water areas, the shelves and that sort of stuff, and some of the deeper water as well. But it's really what's there today. And so I've been keeping track of 16 different rock types as we go along. That's not, if you ask any geologist, there's a lot more sedimentary rocks than that, but this is kind of the generalized. It was basically enough. And so this kind of covers most of the rocks we see. And this is one from the Michigan Basin. In the middle of the basin, this is the rocks we see and the sequences we see. And you notice, if you remembered, he doesn't have every sequence there. It's missing the last sequence. There's no Tejas in Michigan at all. There's just a very small amount of Absarica and Zuni. So not everywhere, like in Grand Canyon, we don't see any Tippecanoe, for example. So not all these advances as the water was progressing higher and higher. Not everyone flooded the same areas over and over. But for the most part, early on, the early flood areas flooded just the same areas over and over, as we'll see. So the Bible talks about the fountains of the deep were broke open in Genesis 7:11. And here's our pre-flood world that we put together based on our data points. This is from looking at just 3 continents and then kind of estimating what the rest of the world would be based on some data. But we're going to make a new map of this here shortly. Now that we have the whole world done, we're going to take a closer look. You can see North America is kind of there in the center, a little bit to the left. And you get South America and Africa and places you can kind of piece it all together. But we think that broke apart during the flood year. This is what the fountains of the deep were. We believe they were the cracks that God miraculously cracked open the earth on these long linear fractures and outspewed magma and water. These ocean ridges we see today are remnants of that with, there's other plates that moved around. And so like John Baumgartner talked about, we'll talk about here in a minute, I do believe in the rapid plate movement or runaway subduction, or it's commonly called catastrophic plate tectonics. But if you keep track of the Earth is the only planet that has tectonic plates that have moved. And so it's, again, I think this was the mechanism that the Lord used to cause the flood. And so once he cracked open the earth and things started to subduct, he started destroying some of the original old ocean crust and making new ocean crust that caused these continents to move around very, very rapidly in the year of the flood. And so things are moving, I think about 7 or 8 kilometers per hour. That is what John Baumgartner estimates, about 5 miles per hour here in the U.S. And so depends. I'm trying to do both because I know we have a Canadian audience and some U.S. audience. And not everybody's familiar with the metric system in the U.S. as they are in Canada. So here's the man that really kind of gave me the ideas, and he and I have collaborated on a few things, and we've talked quite a bit over the years, and we pretty much agree that what he's seeing making new ocean crust is what pushed the water onto the continents. And so the more ocean crust you made, and we'll talk about this a little later, the more ocean crust that was made, the more it was made hot and hot new things, they inflate. Like a hot air balloon, they push the bottom of the ocean up. So the more ocean you started to make, the more the water started pushing on the land. So these tsunami waves generated by rapid plate movement would be hundreds of them a day, if not thousands, are being pushed higher and higher and higher as the flood progressed and made more ocean crust. So I'll come back to that later if I went a little bit fast through that. But John Baumgartner, his research, his modeling, and these supercomputers he used when he worked for the U.S. government, developed this idea of runaway subduction, that the rocks in the earth and the crust and the shallow mantle, upper mantle, how they would behave, and they would actually start running away at a certain point, and they'd be dropping the plates into the mantle almost like a weight in water. And so nobody has shown his math to be wrong. They just kind of ignore him and think that maybe he'll go away. But he's known by many people, even the evolutionary scientists. He's well respected geophysicist. They just don't understand why he's gone wrong. But he really hasn't gone wrong. This is really what the rocks would do and did do, and the evidence is there that we can see today, as we'll talk about more. So what he proposes is, again, more seafloor being made, pushing water higher and higher. And that's exactly what we see. It's a perfect match between his mechanism of runaway subduction and rapid plate motion and rapid new crust being made in the oceans, pushing the sea level up, like the bottom of your bathtub going up. You're going to get water's going to go somewhere. And so it goes on to the continents. But it did it progressively because as you made more ocean crust, it progressively pushed the water up more and more and more. So here's kind of a cartoon of that shows, the runaway subduction, and you can see the volcanoes that are caused by that, like we see in like the Cascades in Washington, Oregon, all around the world, the Andes, all these places where there's a subduction zone. During the flood year, we think is moving really, really fast, and so this was really humming along. And as you subduct it away, you've got to make new crust at that ridge you kind of see there with the magma coming up, and that's making new ocean crust. So you make new ocean crust. The same amount that you're subducting away to keep the earth the same size, so it all works out in the end. But that new crust was hotter. And what's amazing, and since John Baumgartner proposed this about 25 years ago, In the last 20 years, they've been shooting seismic tomography all over the Earth in these subduction zones and seeing these cold slabs. The densities that they infer from these imply that these are very, very cold. So you look at the bottom of these graphs, and the colors represent cold. Blue means the coldest. And so blue is like the crust coming down into the mantle. And we see here this final one. You can see the plate, subducted plate goes all the way down to the bottom of the mantle and almost bends around like a spaghetti noodle down there. So it's getting very hot, but it still retains its cold temperature that it started with. So if these were really subducting very, very slowly at the rate of a couple centimeters per year, like we see today, how come you still have all these cold slabs deep down there on top of the core? Went down. They take 70 million years or so to get down that deep at current rates. So those would have heated up. They shouldn't still be hot. And there's these enigmas down there, these cold slabs that the evolutionary geologists have not explained because it actually fits. And to me, it confirms John Baumgartner's model. People say there's no evidence, but the evidence is there. Here's the geophysical evidence showing there really was a period in the past of runaway subduction for all these cold slabs, which you saw some of. And then this one shows this cold rock deep in the earth that shouldn't be cold because you're looking at over 3,000 degrees, temperature hotter. Why would this stuff after 70 million years still be as cold as almost as at the surface? So to me, this is compelling evidence that there really was an episode of runaway subduction, that his math has never been shown to be wrong. His math and his ideas are correct. So then the Bible goes on to talk more about the rains on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights. And a lot of people stop here. My wife wants me to remind the audiences all the time that the flood was not just 40 days. I don't know. We get that idea in our head because we sing songs and, it's church little kids and we make the flood out to be cute and rafts popping up through the thing. And it was a devastating judgment for the wickedness of the whole world. The whole world was so wicked, God said, I got to start over. And he only found 8 people were righteous enough to actually get on the ark and survive. But this was the beginning. And a lot of this is also thought to be by John Baumgartner and others. Now, this may be some of the water that was, evaporating very, very quickly and shooting up as big geysers as you were releasing that magma under the water. And so that's more study needs to be done on that. But subduction, of course, causes tsunamis. And this is the one in Japan. It was a seawall here. We're kind of cheating because it's hard to get good images of tsunamis without the people perishing in the process. And so this was kind of way to get one that looks like a wall of water coming in, but it's really a little bit, we're cheating a bit here. But they do cause these tsunamis that come in across the continents. And so early on in the flood year, the first 3 sequences, the Sauk, the Tippecanoe, and the Kaskaskia shown here, I don't really think in my sea level curve there, again, goes higher to the left. I really don't see a high rise in sea level because that's not what the data shows. That's not what the rocks show. So here's the Sauk mega sequence where we see it today. The color is kind of that dark purplish color. And a lot of this has been eroded by later uplift. And of course, this doesn't show the continents being together. I wasn't sure if I should show it that way or the current way, so I went with the current way. People more familiar, but this is where the Sauk mega sequence, Cambrian rocks, for example, are there today. And so you see some of southernmost Ontario is covered by that, and most of the southern peninsula, Michigan, some of the upper peninsula, it's all in there. And this stuff goes all the way down to Grand Canyon. But there's very little in South America, and there's only North Africa and kind of across Central Europe and a few places. And most of India is high and dry. Most of Africa, at this point, this was the extent of the flooding. It kind of shows, even though there's a few holes in it from later uplift and erosion and the receding phase of the flood, this still gives us a good idea of where the flooding was occurring and where it wasn't occurring. So let's move on to the next sequence. So before I do that, there's also sandstones like the Sauk sandstone, commonly called the Tapete sandstone because that's what it's called in Grand Canyon, that goes across much of the United States and into Canada and around, kind of swirls around the northernmost provinces as well, up to those little islands. In Nunavut, I think it's called. I'm not sure the name anymore. Since I was in school, you guys changed the name on me. But it goes up to Maritime province as well. But this is one sandstone, a big blanket sandstone. It's pure sandstone. It's not mixed with clay except in a few spots. That yellow represents sandstone. So how do you get about 100 to 300 foot sandstone that covers this much of a continent, all laid down at approximately the same time without a flood? And evolutionary scientists, they struggle trying to explain these blanket sands. They occasionally will write a paper about every 5 years trying to explain them away. But they don't have, just like the cold slabs deep in the mantle, they don't have a good explanation for these, but we do. because these indicate this was all deposited very quickly, probably within a matter of days during the flood. And you see the same sandstone on every continent. This is the basal layer of the Sauk megasequence, that basal sandstone layer. So you see everywhere there's yellow, that's a sandstone. Everywhere there's blue, it's limestone. And a couple other spots are red or volcanics and things like that. But you see a lot of sandstone across North Africa, across the United States, across Europe. So those basal layers were often a high energy enough deposit from these waves coming in to deposit sand. And then this is the next sequence that piles right on top. So again, you don't see much of Africa being covered. You don't see much of South America being covered. And Europe, I couldn't have drawn it any better. It goes right on top of it. And so it's right at top in North America as well. Most of these areas mimic the same areas because you're only flooding the same, what I believe to be shallow seas. So early on, you're only flooding the lowest areas, which were shallow seas that covered much of Ontario and Michigan. Those areas, that's why we only see marine rocks there, marine critters in those rocks. No dinosaurs at all, except in our museums. So, but it's the consistency of these first three sequences. You'll see the next sequence does almost the same thing as well. So here's the Kaskaskia on top of that. And notice again, just North Africa gets colored. And much of the United States and southern Canada, same areas of Europe, but you get a little more offshore, northern Europe. But again, these first three sequences only flood the same areas over and over and over. Most of the world was still high and dry. So I believe this is about to day 40 of the flood. You're on depositing in these areas. Most of Africa was high and dry. Most of South America, much of Canada was still high and dry. But when you put it back into Pangea, you get these big areas that were still high and dry. Those are probably the highest areas, particularly where land animals were living, as we'll see. Now, what's interesting in these first three areas, all we see is marine fossils. Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, it's all marine. So I believe these were, and the consistency of the same areas, just on top of each other, just limited parts of the continents, to me, tells you that it was the same environment being flooded over and over. And the fossils tell us these were shallow seas. And then you go to chapters 4 and 5, or the next couple of sequences up. And I believe this is after day 40. A little bit of question mark there to day 150, where I believe the flood peaked. And the Bible says the flood was 40 days on the earth, and the water increased and buried up the ark. So it wasn't until after day 40 that the ark started to float. That's why I think those first three sequences were, which only show mostly marine animals over and over and over. 99.9% are just marine animals. I believe those areas, you weren't really flooding the land yet until we now know we're flooding the land, because the ark, the Bible tells us the ark starts to float. And it says the waters prevailed, increased greatly, waters prevailed exceedingly, until the whole earth was covered, it goes on to say. So the ark floated, of course, but at this point I want to remind people that the door of the ark was salvation. If you had gone through that door, you would have been saved from this judgment. And, Noah preached the whole time he was building the ark, which was many, many decades, it sounds like, based on the estimates of theologians. And Jesus, of course, is now our door of salvation. So those people could have been saved if they'd have just believed enough to go through that door on the ark and join Noah and his family. But only 8 people did. Maybe 1 billion people at that point, 1,600 and some years after the creation, there might have been over 1 billion people on the earth. They all perished in the flood. And it was probably a judgment because of human wickedness and the violence of the whole earth. The dinosaurs were eating each other. They were doing the things they weren't supposed to do. They were supposed to just eat plants. And that was the way God created everything. There would be no death, no bloodshed in the perfect world that God created until Adam and Eve sinned. But ultimately, God had a plan for redemption. He would step in, and we celebrate that at Christmas with the birth of Jesus. But he was there to, find the lost. He was there to save the lost, like myself and hopefully you, if you're listening to this. But he is the door of salvation, just like that was the door of salvation for the ark. So once that door was shut, the people outside the ark, their fates were sealed. And once we die, our fates are sealed if we chose Jesus or not. And so the most important decision you can make in your life in eternity is accepting Jesus as your Savior. He is that door. He's done it all. He takes away the sin of the world, just like John called out. The Lamb of God takes away the sin of the world. So I can encourage the listeners enough to, not really walk through that door, but to open the door of your heart to Jesus. But back to the geology. The geology progresses as well and moving to the next sequence. And now you notice my sea level curve goes up, and we now start to see a lot more coverage on the continents. Notice across Africa, a lot more of Southern Africa is covered. It still has holes and it's still kind of wormy because a lot of erosion that took place as the water receded, stripped right down in many places. But there's still enough of it still up there. There's even, there's very little in Canada, but it's across the United States and Western Canada. But just see a lot more coverage across Europe, a lot more coverage across Asia. Something different was happening where you're getting more rocks spread over the world a lot more. I believe it's because sea level went higher. And you see more of the splitting of the continents at this point. The ocean crust was really starting to form a lot of ocean crust very, very quickly all over the world. Whereas before you might not have had too much formed. Most of the ocean actually only goes back to the Absarica, to the sequence. So most of the ocean crust turned over completely from this point on. And that's what really pushed the water higher and higher as you make more seafloor. Higher, that seafloor was hot like a hot air balloon, and it was pushing up the water from below, just like the bottom of your bathtub coming up. So you can see this, you can image this out. All the red is the youngest, the orange is next, kind of older. Eventually the green and the blues are the oldest, and it only goes back to the Absarica. So we can map this out, and here's what the crust did. It pushed up from below, just like that cartoon shows. As you make more crust quicker and subduct faster, you push more of the bottom of the seafloor up, and that caused the water to go higher. And so that the water changed as well, because the water is very incompressible. And that's why if you push the bottom up, it's got to go higher under the. So these tsunami waves were now going much, much higher than they were. And you made more, the higher they went. And so now after day 40, the ark's floating. We know that you're now flooding the continents and the land, and you're sweeping away plants, you're sweeping away forests, you're sweeping away animals that lived in the lowest elevations, on the land, the lowland areas. I think I went a little too fast there. You're seeing all these different things. I can go back maybe one. It's the first appearance of coal beds all over the world too. And before this, there's a few thin coal beds, but again, just like land animals, you don't see too many of them until this mega sequence kicks in the Absarica mega sequence. And you see the first land animals always mixed with marine. So you're washing these big waves in from the ocean, you're going to bring in marine critters, marine animals, and you're going to mix them with the land animals. And that's what we see everywhere I've looked in the world, from India to South America. Anywhere I go, you see mixing. And I know some people say there's no mixing, but that's a consequence of the flood. You're washing in ocean waves. As the water came higher, these waves are bringing in ocean critters and pushing them all the way across North America. They get mosasaurs in Kansas, and sharks up with T-Rexes up in Montana, 6 different species of sharks. These things were, eventually the whole world was covered, because that's what we believe as creation geologists, but that's what the data shows. So it's not a coincidence that suddenly we're getting coal seams all over the world, every continent, and land animals all over the world, every continent, because every continent was flooding a little higher at this point, and that's what the rocks showed. So now we're going to move our way up. We're starting to flood the animals before the dinosaurs. Eventually we get to the dinosaurs themselves, and we get into the sequence, which I believe is the peak of the flood, and that's the Zuni. And this ends about just after the time the dinosaurs disappear. So you wipe out your entire ecosystem, and it looks like an extinction event to the evolutionists, but really you just go from ecological zone, higher and higher and higher as you work your way up. And every time there's a big change in ecological zones and plants and animals that all lived at the same elevations, once those were gone, you went to the next level. And so it looks like there's a big sudden change, but really it's just the flood was progressing higher and higher from lowland areas to little higher areas, eventually to the upland areas. And I believe most of Canada was upland. Most of India was an upland. That's where the humans were living. That's where the horses were living. That's where the camels were living. Things that we see buried on top of dinosaurs all over the world as the water kind of went over the top and then washed these animals back down. But the Zuni is really the peak. I think this is where we really see the maximum coverage of the earth, and we see pretty much the maximum volume deposited at this time as well. So it's the data that drives my interpretation. The maximum coverage still today, even after all the erosion of uplift the mountains and uplift and the flood receding, moving rocks off the continents into the oceans, even after all that, the Zuni is still pretty much the peak in terms of its coverage today, the surface coverage, and it's the peak of the volume. So you go from the Sauk tip, and Kaskaskia, the first sequences, they're very minimal coverage and they're very minimal volume. And you double the volume in the Absarica, you double it again in the Zuni. And it's 1/3 of the sedimentary rocks full of fossils was deposited in the Zuni mega sequence alone. Then we get another 1/3 in what I believe is the receding phase in the Tejas. So here's the Zuni. This is the maximum coverage. You see a lot more offshore because the continents is separated at this point. North America and Africa and South America and Africa had split. And so you get pretty much the whole world. There's a couple little dots up there in the Hudson Bay, though. Notice those two tiny little yellowish orange dots representing the Zuni. To me, that's the bathtub ring. It tells you the water did go over the top of Canada. It just didn't, wasn't very deep. And so it left a few remnants behind in what I call the bathtub ring. And so a lot of these places like Africa, the world at this point in day 150 of the flood would have been totally covered. By about the end of the Zuni, end of the Cretaceous, would have been completely covered, like the Bible says. And then when the water drained off, it eroded away some of that. The Ice Age eroded away some of that, but it still left a few remnants even up in Canada. So here's what the world would look like in day 150 from space without the big banner. But remember, the Bible tells us only went 15 cubits or 23 feet above the highest hills. And so it wasn't very high. Water was zipping across maybe 50 miles an hour like tsunamis do with shallow water. They still go pretty quick. In the deep ocean, they're going 500 miles an hour, but when they get to the land, they're zipping across. And I know there was Hugh Ross criticizes in his new book about the flood. He criticizes there's no evidence for the flood. And he also says that Noah and the ark couldn't have survived with all these tsunamis. Well, if they're out in deep water, the tsunami waves just zip right by. They don't really affect anything. The navies and stuff, when there's a tsunami warning, they send their ships out to sea. It's only when you're near the shore that these waves build and push things in. So the marine animals that were near the shore, they're the ones that got pushed onto the land and pushed higher and higher each time. If you're in the deep ocean, you're not really affecting the animals living out there, but you're also not affecting any sort of vessel that's out there as well. So the ark would have been perfectly safe out there in the deep water from the tsunami waves, contrary to what people like Hugh Ross say. Finally, you get to chapter 6, which I believe is the receding phase. This is the Tejas mega sequence. The Bible talks about, after day 150, the water peaked and the ark grounds. Because I think some land came up and the ark kind of ran aground, even though the water was still everywhere. And the Bible talks about in Genesis 8:13 how Noah looked out of the ark and the earth was dry. And that ends up being about day 314. And then they had to stay on the ark for another till 60 days or so, until day 371 before God said, open the door, because they had to wait a while for some vegetation to grow from day 314 to day 371. If you do the math, I figure out, this day of this month of that year of the flood, they were on the ark over a year, 371 days. But I believe the water had drained off the continents by day 314, according to the Bible. So God talks about in Genesis 8, it changes gears from a rising sea level to a lowering sea level, and talks about the water assuaged, means it went back and forth. The fountains were stopped. The rain was stopped. So it rained beyond 40 days. It was raining throughout the whole time, and just early on, because it wasn't flooding much of the land in those first three sequences, just flooding the shallow seas. I think it's just described as rain. And so, but I believe the rain was going on until God stops it here sometime after 150 days or thereabouts, and maybe even beyond that. So the water started going down. Well, why would the water go down? Where did it go? The water went down because the sea floors that were created new and hot finally started to cool. And as they cool, of course, they're going to cool and contract and shrink, and they sink back down. And so the water, even though you're still making a lot of seafloor through the Tejas mega sequence, through the receding phase, more of the ocean crust was cooling, like in the deep Pacific Ocean and these areas that were cooling and sinking. And those are the deepest areas of the world today. These really areas a long way away from these ridges. And so the water cooled, or the ocean crust cooled and sank, and that's where they drew the water back down. And God, it also says he had a wind he helped blow it off with, but it took over a half a year for the water to go down. So it's a long, long time. Not represented in my graph here. This is not by time. This is using the evolutionary names and just stacking them on there. But the Tejas lasted, about a half a year. So a lot of receding going on, a lot of assuaging going on. I can't represent all that on my graph. But here's the Tejas where the water was going down. This is also the period when most of the world's mountains pop up. The Rockies pop up at this point. The Alps pop up at this point. The Himalayas pop up at this point because the collision with India hadn't even happened yet until halfway through the Tejas. So most of the world's mountains pop up all at the same time, which is a mystery to the evolutionary community. Why would 80% of the world's mountains all form at the same time? Whereas before that, you only had like the Appalachians form from some early collisions during the flood with early flood rocks, and the Urals the same way. But most of the world's mountains all formed as the water was receding, which I think also helped push the water off the continents. And that's a lot of that's a consequence of what we call in geophysics isostatic rebound. If you thicken the crust, you're going to push the crust up rapidly to compensate for it. And so these subduction zones, you were thickening the crust, almost doubling the crust, and that caused a lot of these areas, the mountains, to rise 10, 20,000 feet. And you got these big peaks that popped up, and that eroded away a lot of the sediment. So you see there's no tejas on the Andes or the Rockies in most of these areas because it eroded off. But this is still what's there today. And a lot of it's onshore, but a lot of it's offshore as well. And so we'll move right along. So now we went over the top where I believe you had the uplands. And again, Canada would have been where you have the lemurs that we find on top of the dinosaurs, the horses, the camels, all these different mammals that lived at higher elevation. We're eating different plants at that higher elevation that God made for them to eat versus what the dinosaurs were eating at lower elevation. Their plants were different. So the animals stayed in these ecological zones, these tiers that I believe the pre-flood world was made like, because that's their food source. They're not going to stray far from your food source. So God made a certain couple plants for you to eat. Even though you might have been eating another dinosaur, your T-Rexes are going to stay near the plants that they were designed to eat originally in God's original plan. So the animals weren't running up and down the hills, and they weren't commingling with humans and horses with dinosaurs. We don't see that. We don't see a lot of mixing. We see mixing with marine because the waves are washing in marine things, but we don't see a lot of mixing of environments in terms of the animals. We do see mammals and birds with dinosaurs, but the mammals are mostly squirrel type animals or beaver type animals. They're not the traditional upland animals you'd see like camels and horses and things that humans raise for livestock. So again, here's the crust cooling and slowing down. Once it slowed down, and you're subducting away. You subducted away the entire original cold crust. So once all the cold crust is gone, no longer could you subduct very quickly. It wasn't cold enough to sink. The density was now, everything was too buoyant. Just like running out of gas in your car, it just stops. And so the world, all the plates just kind of slowed way down to just like 2-3 centimeters per year now that we're seeing, because all the original cold crust is now gone. That was the gravitational energy, basically the difference between the original cold crust and the new hot crust. That's what caused the subduction to stop. And it's a good thing. We'd still be moving at 5 miles an hour or 7 or 8 kilometers per hour. That's pretty scary, making a lot of waves just with the continents moving around. So today they move very slow. There's still a little bit of magma oozing out of these ocean ridges, but they're very narrow. And they're not broad like they were during the rapid movement of the plates. So God had a mechanism to stop everything too. Once the original crust was all gone and consumed, you now have hot crust. The hot crust doesn't want to sink. It's too buoyant, and so everything just kind of stopped. So we have a mechanism for starting the flood with a miracle. God cracked open the earth. Once he cracked it open, subduction began, because you have very cold things on very hot things, which is much more dense. It starts to sink. And then once that ran through its whole cycle over the course of the year of the flood, actually before that even, you ran out of basically the gravitational difference to continue the subduction, so everything just kind of stopped. Hopefully that makes some sense. And there's interesting features I found in my studies. So in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a sand out there way out, a couple hundred miles offshore called the Whopper Sand, when all the water was receding off the continent. And so here in the deep Gulf of Mexico, they found a sand that's over 1,000 foot, almost 2,000 foot thick. Again, you're looking at 600 meters, almost 400 to 600 meters of sand, if I'm doing the math right in my head, converting that for you metric people. But why is this out there? 200 miles offshore or more, in 7,000 and 10,000 feet of water? They're drilling wells out there and going, where'd the sand come from? So the evolutionary guys said, this is a Whopper sand that shouldn't be here. And they have no model to get it out there. But the receding phase of the flood can do it. This is the very first pulse. The bottom of the receding phase, the bottom of the tejas, has this massive sand in it, just like we saw sands at the bottom of many sequences. And after that, it's mostly clay. So there's no model from rivers. There's no model from any sort of environment today pushing sand offshore. This is almost pure sand that's over 1,000 foot thick, that covers the deepest parts, the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. And then you pile thousands of feet of clay and mud on top of that. And once these are folded over the right features, they can trap oil They found about 15 billion barrels of oil out there so far on this one sand dripped over certain structures. So the oil and gas geologists don't know how it got there, but they don't really care. It's there. And so they weren't expecting it. They just drilled and said, it's interesting. They could see in their seismic a little bit of what they call bright spots. It looked like there was something there. So a couple of companies got brave and drilled out there. When I worked for Chevron, our chief geologist and I talked on this about 10 years ago after he retired. He said, yeah, we wouldn't let you guys look out there because we didn't think there's any way to get sand out there. Well, they still can't explain how the sand got out that far and so thick and so pure. But only the flood, again, can explain that, as the receding phase, just like water pouring off a parking lot, real high velocity, can carry all that sand way out there, hundreds of miles of offshore, and then eventually it slowed down and you got more and more clay stacked on top. So I'm going to summarize with just this little chart here. I'm going to quit and turn it back over to Donny. But every continent has the same patterns that I've seen, all 7 continents, although the jury's still out on Antarctica, but what little bit I know about it, what little bit I could plot up, I still found over 100 kilometers onshore and offshore. But the other 6 continents, and I'm sure Antarctica is the same, every continent shows the same order of rocks. We see the same order, not always every sequence or mega sequence, but we see the same order. We always see sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it's never, you may be missing one like a Grand Canyon where it goes 1 to 3, but you never go 1, 2, 3. It never goes like 1, 2, 3, and then 6, and then 5. It's always 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then 6. So no matter what the order is, it's always, you might be missing 1 or 2 of them, but they always follow the same exact order, the same exact patterns. We're seeing the same areas flooded over and over and over in the early sequences, same areas over and over. And it's not just coincidence. It's because you're only flooding shallow seas. So every kind of really shows the same order of rocks. You can look in the Williston Basin in North Dakota, the Tarim Basin in China, the Darrell High in Syria. Those areas, you actually have all 6 sequences. In most areas, you only have 5 or 4 or 3. But again, they're always in the same proper order. They're always getting higher and higher numbers. Whether you're missing 2 or not, it's always 1, 3, 4, 5, 6 or something like that. You don't jump back and forth. The numbers aren't all jumbled up at random. Always the same order. So how does every continent do the same thing and build the same pile of pancakes, so to speak? Secondly, every continent shows a progressive flood. Every continent starts out minimal flooding early, repeating that, and all of a sudden, boom, on the 4th sequence coming up, suddenly a lot more coverage, then the maximum coverage in the Zuni, and then the receding phase. How does every continent do that? I even had Australia done after we made this graphic. And so 6 continents are showing the same pattern. I'm sure Antarctica will too. So again, it's every continent does this. They show minimum flooding early, and then more and more flooding, showing a true progressive flood. And thirdly, every continent shows the same order of fossils. The fossils do the exact same thing. You start out with just marine fossils, and then you get some more marine fossils. And then you get some more marine fossils in the first 3 sequences, a little bit different each time from you flooding a little deeper water. And then suddenly you start to flood the land, you get coal seams and land animals mixed in. And then you go up higher, you get different land animals and different types of coal. And finally at the top, you get the animals and the plants that lived at the highest elevations, mostly mammals that we're more familiar with, that lived with probably where the humans were, and also more flowering plants. Completely different type of coals formed later than you see earlier in the flood. Only makes sense when you look at these progressive flood that flooded all the continents. And finally, every continent peaks at about the same time. I talked about this earlier. If you add up all the continents, you can look at the data. You can see here's my 6 continents I had so far, and I'll have Antarctica soon. You see basically the same pattern. Everything progresses from minimum volume. This isn't surface coverage, this is volume in each continent. Europe maybe peaks a little bit sooner because Europe, I think, was more of a lowland area, didn't have much in the uplands, so it peaks a little earlier. But when you add all these up, take all the volume, I believe Africa probably shows it the best because there's no mountains to mess things up with or add more receding phase material. Like a lot of these mountains shed a lot more material as they came up, they eroded off the tops, and so that made a lot of the yellow, which would be the Tejas. But each one of these, as you'll progress across from left to right, it's the Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, Absarica in purple. Brown is the Zuni, which I believe is the peak, and then yellow is the receding phase. Again, the receding phase, you have 1/3 of the rock record in the receding phase, all in the Tejas. That's a massive amount of sediment being deposited because you're draining off all this water off the continents as you go. But here's the total of 6 continents right here in terms of the volume. The sock makes up about 6%, the tip of canoe 4, cast 7, and then boom, look at the Abserica jumps up where you start to flood the land, start to get coal seams, start to get land animals, because you're flooding more of the continents. We see the surface coverage jumps up dramatically as well. And then the Zuni, boom, 32% deposit there, plus the maximum coverage. And the Tejas is second in volume. Actually, I think it does cover maybe a little bit more because you add up all the offshore areas. It spreads out a little bit more. But nonetheless, tremendous amount of sediment at the end as the water was peaking and as the water was receding all over the world. The early flooding was very, very minimal. It looks like a lot across the United States because a lot of the United States, I believe, was a shallow sea. But most of the world, most of the continents didn't flood at all until you get to that Abserica mega sequence. And then the Zuni, of course, there's the peak. And then the Tejas was the receding phase. So I'll do one little thing tied to the Bible. Rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. That's the first few sequences. And the waters increased and brought up the ark on day 40. And the waters prevailed, increased greatly. Genesis says the water prevailed exceedingly until all the earth, all the mountains were covered, which probably were high hills, maybe 5,000 feet in elevation. And then the waters returned from the earth continually because God remembered Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord and all the animals as well. So I'm going to exit here and escape back and stop the share and turn it back over to Donny.
Dr. Clarey, excellent slide.
It was a lot. I know it was a lot, but I don't know where you are now.
Oh, if you come back to the StreamYard browser, do you see that at the bottom?
Yeah.
Or possibly the top in.
Yeah, there we are.
Good to see you again, brother.
Hey,
and
I thought you fell asleep.
Never. No, I would.
Okay.
It flew by.
There was a lot of intense material in there, but I know the Canadians can handle it, and the Midwest people can handle it because we talk faster up there. Because if I tell the Texans, if we don't talk fast, our mouths freeze up.
It's true.
And so, the Texans down here, they drag out their vowels and they talk a lot slower, and they're like, "You talk fast." I'm like, well. Yeah, that's why I grew up talking fast. I was the youngest of 4 boys, so I had to say a lot to get a lot in at the right time. And
that's right. You've had a lot of practice.
I apologize. That's why I try to repeat. I try to repeat myself a lot as I was going through that a little bit. Hopefully, it made some sense.
It made a lot of sense.
Okay, good.
And nothing to apologize for. That was a good, solid, informative crash course as to why mega sequences point to the reality of the global, my brother, not the local. Genesis flood.
Amen. When people say where's the evidence for it? It's right there. It's if you start, spend 12 years of your life like I did plotting this data up all over the world, the rocks still scream out, this was a global event. Everything's doing the same thing at the same time, peaking at about the same time. I mean, how do you explain that other than a global event? I just don't understand it. But, Hugh Ross's new book that just came out, he doesn't even mention me once. Wow. And I've been publishing some of this stuff, for off and on for the last 8 or 10 years. I think a lot of people don't know how to deal with what the rocks really show. And the rocks really do show a global event, a global catastrophe that progressed. Because you're making more seafloor, it's exactly what you get. If you don't make it all at once, it takes, half a year to make a lot of seafloor. And the more you made, the more they'll push the water higher and higher and higher. And so, you think about this, people probably all didn't die till day 150, like the Bible says. That was a long, painful, slow judgment where they kept trying to look at higher and higher land and like, well, where were they going to go? Eventually they realized there's nowhere to go. And that, the regret and the pain these people must have felt, for not believing Noah and what God told Noah to tell people. And that's unfortunate what people that are going to die without Jesus. They're going to be painfully regretting that for eternity as they're sent to eternal torment. Whereas those of us that believe in Jesus, our sins are forgiven and we'll be with Jesus. And so it's really all about salvation. And there was this judgment, but there's going to be another judgment. But we escaped that, because our sins are forgiven through Jesus.
Amen. I love that you bring it back to the gospel. One reason why is because, okay, we could win arguments all day, Dr. Clarey, but it's about winning souls. It's about bringing people the saving gospel message of Jesus Christ. And so Hugh Ross's new book, then, obviously you're not persuaded. You address one of his arguments about the tsunamis in your talk, but I find it interesting and I'm wondering your thoughts. I find this is typical and commonplace with anti-young earth creationists like William Lane Craig, Hugh Ross, They will say, as you made the point in your presentation, Hugh Ross asserts that there's no evidence for a worldwide flood. There's no evidence for a global flood, but yet he's not engaging, because you point out the fact that he didn't even mention you in his book, yet all the work that you've done showing the science of the global Genesis flood. And so do you find that they're not actually engaging our best scientific lines of evidence for a global flood, Dr. Clarey?
I think that's true, and I think that they have to. I think in some ways they don't address John Baumgartner's work thoroughly as well. They just kind of dismiss him and say, Hugh Ross talks about, well, this is ridiculous that he says, the things can move that fast when the rocks don't support that. But when he studied the layers of the earth, the crust and the mantle, and what those rocks, the strength of those rocks, and the temperatures of those rocks, when you put all the best knowledge that we have today, anybody has, of what those layers are like, this is exactly what he determined. In his models, he said, just as a subductor is going to reach a certain critical temperature, it's just going to drop right in. And nobody has ever shown that that's wrong. And yet we're finding in those seismic tomography, as we image deep in the mantle better and better, we're seeing evidence that there's all these cold slabs that look like they really did drop down there really fast because they're still cold. And so that isn't brought up at all. He doesn't bring up any of that. They do this quick cursory. They make a lot of blanket statements like there's no evidence, no reputable geologist or geophysicist believes in, right or catastrophic plate tectonics. And no reputable geologist, which he says several times, shows there's any evidence for a global flood. And just talks about a lot of local floods in there. And the, William Lane Craig and others talk about these allegories and how this is all just mythological, book of Genesis, especially the chapters 1 through 11. But it's one of those things where it's written completely as history, and Hugh Ross even admits that. But then he still doesn't want to believe that there was this global flood. He still goes with the evolutionary timescales, where people were living. The Ice Age ended 12,000 years ago, and 100,000 years ago. He still goes with those as valid dates. But they really don't want to address, the real hard and fast data that I've been finding. They really don't want to address. They'll admit many times, like, we love your data, Tim, like I said earlier, but we don't like your interpretation. And so they realize this is the real data that's there, but my database is as valid as you're going to get at a continental scale that I've gotten with over, I think, about 3,400 columns now globally. It may not sound like a lot, but every one of those I had to build, from hand, put in the computer or database. And when you look at it on the map, as you saw, some of those points were showing up, it's pretty comprehensive. And so I don't think anybody's done this ever as comprehensive as we have, because now we have so much more data offshore that we can tie into as well. So it's unfortunately, they don't really address us. They just kind of say things like there's no evidence for the global flood, and there's no reputable geologist or geophysicist would say such things. And it kind of dismisses us without really addressing and getting a good conversation going and really talking about the data. How do you explain the Whopper sand? That's, how do you explain these cold slabs deep in the mantle? I could go on and on and on with many other things. And there's a lot of things that we don't understand as creationists either. How do you get all this salt? Thousands of feet of salt in the Gulf of Mexico, pure salt. How do you get all that out there? And then that moved around and made all these oil traps and got squished by the receding sediments column on top. They say, well, how do you guys explain it? And I ask them, evolutionary guys, how do you explain that much pure salt? That's how you explain coal seams in Wyoming that are 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers, 60 miles by 60 miles, that are 200 foot thick, pure coal. And I was a student at Wyoming. We went out there I took a coal class. We went to a field trip up to the Bighorn, or the Powder River Basin in northeast Wyoming. And we looked at one of these 100-foot coal seams, and our professor's like, we got nothing, nothing to explain this much coal over this much area. And so when a push comes to shove, the data, all the stuff that I've been able to gather and see, and a lot of my book talks about some of the things, and I'll be putting more things in my second book that shows the rest of the world. There's all these amazing discoveries that I'm seeing that I just feel so privileged to be able to do this research for at ICR, because people support ICR. They're able to pay my salary to do those. And so if you're a supporter of ICR, or even if you want to just pray for ICR, we need your prayers as well. And Donny, you need prayers too to keep this on the air. And so, Amen. And you need financial help. So, nothing is free, but yet, my research is pretty cheap. People could do this if they want to just get a computer, started looking online, data mining, doing searches by, area, basin, all these things I've spent. I can't remember how many hours I've spent. I wouldn't even fathom, 12 years of my life doing this research, and over 12 years, 12 and a half to finish it all up. That includes, all the other things we do at ICR, traveling and speaking and writing. But it's been just this labor of love. This is the greatest research I've ever done. And some of the most compelling research that I think anybody could ever do is to show them there really was a global signature that's the same on every continent. The rocks, the fossils, they all show the same exact patterns, as I tried to point out at the end there. Just how do you explain that without a global flood? And this kind of stuff is not addressed by most of the evolutionary community, nor the theistic evolutionists, like Hugh Ross, unfortunately. They cherry pick,
Right. And you made so many good points. I love the work that you're doing. It shows me and proves to me that it really is in 2025, almost 2026, a great time to be a biblical creationist. And if I understand William Lane Craig's position correctly, based on some of his more recent videos, he would reject, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hugh Ross's local flood interpretation, because he's saying, yes, Genesis, the Bible is clearly describing a worldwide flood, a worldwide catastrophic event, but we don't have the science to support that. That's just so we have to allegorize it, or it must have some kind of other meaning. So he's at least recognizing that, no, the Bible is clearly teaching a global flood, but then he goes to the science, which you're actually showing, no, the science actually is consistent with what the Bible teaches.
Yeah. Now, Hugh Ross, in his defense, he does say it's a global flood. He admits that that's what the Bible says, but he doesn't. I'm kind of trying to get to the point in his book. I'm 2/3 of the way through it. I'm trying to figure out. I think he's referring to a lot of the sea level rises as the ice age ended, and sea level rose, about 100 and some meters, pretty rapidly. I think that's what he's referring to as the flood, because it happened everywhere. Okay. So in that way, he can say it's global and not just a local flood, but in some ways, it's a local global flood. That's kind of what he's saying from what I understand.
He's got the flood now more than just in Mesopotamia. Like he's got.
I believe so. I believe he's saying that most continents were affected, of course, by this rapid rise in sea level as the ice melted. But to me, the ice age was important at the end because it opened up these land bridges, and God had a plan to get the animals back, and so there was an ice age at the end of the flood, set up by the hot water from the new ocean crust that was made all over, that made the whole water column with 2.3 miles of water. He even says there's not enough water. He flat out says in there's not enough water to flood the whole earth. I'm like, have you done the math? He doesn't back it up with anything. He just says these things. And so, he doesn't think it did flood everything, but even though it might have been global in terms of it affected the coastal areas of all the continents. But that's my understanding of what he's saying. But he flat out says a few comments, and they're like, well, there's no evidence for the global flood geologically. There's he just makes statements, but he doesn't back them up. There's not enough water to flood the whole world. Well, there is. Andrew Snelling did some of the work. If you push the sea level up, you can push the water a mile higher. Right. And that may be enough to flood the whole world, 23 feet right there. And I believe that was the major mechanism that pushed the water around, was the new seafloor pushing the water up. And that caused the water to progressively go higher and higher as the tsunami waves were pushed higher and higher and higher. Eventually, they went over the top. God knew just how much, he had to make. And then he had a plan at the end to repopulate the earth with the ice age. And so people could walk from where the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat all over the world within 500 years. They probably could get everywhere as the ice was peaking, and you had the thick sheets a mile thick across Ontario and Michigan that was sucking up like a sponge so much water that it made sea level pathways that you could walk from France right over to Ireland. You could walk to, basically every continent in the world, except for there's a little bit of water, I think, in some of the areas in Australia. To get to Australia, you still had to go a couple of miles from one piece of land to the next. But for the most part, you could walk anywhere. And the water was so warm, there's even barefoot human footprints along some little island near Vancouver Island in Canada. They have barefoot human footprints in the ice age. They were still walking along barefoot. It was so warm. Because right along the coast, where the water was warm, you would have a microclimate, and the ice would be further inland. So if you stuck along the coast, you could actually follow along ice-free through the Bering, Straits and all the way down across the west coast of Canada, and eventually down into So they were Canadians first before they were true Americans.
And I appreciate you.
In Alaska, we bought Alaska later, but so you have to come across Asia, across to Alaska, and then down along the coast and spread out across to, but.
Well, I appreciate you considering us Canadians in your presentation.
Don't you know,
as well. Yeah, that's right, eh? So
well,
that's a great presentation, right?
It's the Minnesotan.
Right. How about that? So
yeah.
One thing you mentioned in your talk, and then here in the Q&A and in your other videos, which I just find fascinating because I hear all the time with critics and skeptics. We got a good bunch of critics in the live chat here tonight as well. Enough questions to keep us busy till same
good.
time. Your presentation generated a lot of thought,
well, good.
Dr. Clarey.
That's good. I'm glad.
That's what I like. And so the cold slabs. Oh, the critics will say there's just no evidence for catastrophic plate tectonics, meters per second movement of the plates during the time of the global flood. And yet you discuss, and I find it so fascinating, how scientists using seismic tomography, Dr. Clarey, these massive slabs of cooler rock, of dense oceanic crust, basically, from my understanding.
Yeah, the lithosphere, it's about 100 kilometers thick, 60 miles or so. It's the crust plus some of the upper mantle, but basically we call it crust a lot. Just it's reasonable to.
So, if catastrophic plate tectonics were true, as you were saying, this would be an expectation for us to find. And so, is it correct to say that if these were taken there through just normal snail pace movements of the plates, Dr. Clarey, that they should actually be either assimilated temperature wise to the surrounding material or even completely melted?
Yes. And there is a little bit of melting that happens. You steam some of it off, and that's what makes those volcanoes that we see, these explosive volcanoes like Mount St. Helens and Mount Pinatubo all around the world. We see these explosive, subduction zone volcanoes, but most of the slab continues to go down. That's what the tomography is showing. And if it really was moving at just a couple of centimeters per year, as I think I did the math one time, it would take about 75 million years to go from the top of the mantle all the way down to the core, where we're seeing these slabs kind of resting on top of the core. And to do that, of course, at over 3,000 degrees Celsius hotter, it would have assimilated by now. You wouldn't see the density difference. And so what you're really imaging is a difference in density, the density being faster. If it's colder, you're going to get a different velocity of waves going through it. And so they related this back. The only thing they can really conceive this differences is by the temperature. And so they're always seeing these cold blobs, these cold slabs going down, because density is explained essentially as the only way to get that density is to have colder slabs going down. So yes, the answer to your question is they should have assimilated in 75 million years or 50 million years, whatever the case is. The only reason they're still cold is because they went down there quickly. You put your hand in an oven with an oven mitt, even that oven mitt's going to get hot eventually. And so, it's the same thing. You put something down into something that's 3,000 degrees hotter, it's going to start cooking in millions of years of time. And
so if they're arguing that these slabs are basically being thrust down slowly over millions of years, over 75 million years, as you said, based on calculations, how did they account for the density or the temperature? Are they kind of baffled by this, or are they invoking rescue devices?
Yes, they tried to find out. Originally, they tried to say it's a phase change. You're changing phases, but then you would see a dramatic shift. It would be almost you go down a little ways, all of a sudden it changed color because the density would dramatically shift to some other type of rock. But you don't see that. It just stays pretty much the same all the way down. And John Baumgartner has looked at this as well, and he says they don't have any other explanation other than temperature.
Right.
And so they really kind of dodge this. They go around and around in circles. They, just like the original tissues of proteins they find in dinosaur bones, they're saying, well, we know they're still millions of years old. We just don't know how they were preserved that long. Whereas every empirical study in the laboratory tells you these dinosaur original tissues and proteins can't be millions of years old because they decay away too quickly, even under ideal conditions. And so it's the same thing. They kind of dodge around it and never really address it. They'll take students out in the field like myself, and they say, here's two layers of rock laying on top of each other. There's 100 million years of time in between them. Isn't that cool? You can touch, 100 million years of time missing in between. They ever say, well, why are these rocks so flat and parallel to each other with no evidence of erosion in between? You know, if there's 100 million years of time, there should be huge canyons and gullies everywhere. The Earth doesn't make flat layers, and that's what we see in Grand Canyon. But those flat layers are what we see across the continents with oil wells. You can extend those all the way across continent to continent to continent. It's a global phenomenon. Erosion doesn't make flat surfaces, but between every layer of rock, even there's supposed to be a lot of time missing between the sequences, tens of millions of years or maybe even hundreds. Where's the erosion? Occasionally get some uplift. You get a few angular unconformities mixed in with the rocks are like this and the rocks on top are flatter. But for the most part, most of the continents are flat layers on flat layers, just like you see at Grand Canyon. And to explain that to me, they don't address that either. There's so many obvious things that if we point them out, people go, yeah, but nobody brings it up when you're taking geology classes. 9 years of geology classes, and they never bring that kind of stuff up at all.
Wow.
They just give you the standard story. Here's this, feed you the same story, same story. It's like they don't want you to think. I want you to think. Ask questions. That's right. That's all about. We don't have all the answers either. Like I say, we can't explain things that some of the things, they're just part of the problem is there's not enough people that believe in that God created everything 6,000 years ago, that there was a global flood 4,500 years ago or thereabouts. And so we don't have a lot of people that are looking and thinking things the way we are and doing the research. But I just am so thankful to Jesus that I got the chance to do this. This is, to me, it's Amen. Like every time I do a continent, it's like a new Christmas present to see what. Yeah. So I'm waiting for Antarctica. I can't wait to see what the final results are on that once I got all the data in and kind of open up that present and see. And then I'll hopefully get carved in stone 2 out there in the next year or two. So
I can't wait. I'm praying for your work, brother. I'm praying for your work.
Yeah, thank you. There's other evidence too that I've got a rock over here I can grab real quick. If I can find it. Maybe I moved some. I had a rock behind me that shows a lot of melted rock. I went to Alaska, and there's a place called Pasagshak Peninsula, Pasagshak Point on Kodiak Island, and there's an old subduction zone that happened during the flood year. The evolutionists would say, an old subduction zone is no longer active, but there you have rock there that's melt is this thick from these rocks sliding past each other, and today, we don't see hardly any melt when there's a big earthquake. You might see just a millimeter or something of melt, but to get that much melt, the evolutionary community says there had to be an extraordinary, just ridiculous amount of rapid movement that took place to make that much melt, to melt the rock from just the friction to get there's a couple of sequences. It's the thickest in the world they found so far. It's over almost a foot thick. And to get that much melt, they said that they don't even want to put a number on it. It's just too much. And so to me, that's another evidence that there was runaway subduction going on, because there's a subduction zone that's exposed today by later uplift. And you see the melt. You can see the rocks that melted from the frictional heat. So not only is there seismic tomography showing that there's physical rocks at the surface where you get some exposed subduction zone that show it as well. And so his prediction that, John Baumgartner didn't predict, we're going to go find all this stuff. He just showed there's what the geophysics, here's what the models show.
Right.
And I don't think he had any idea that we're going to see this in some of the surface geology. We're going to see this in the seismic tomography. But it's a prediction that he could have and should have made, I guess, in some ways, predict that they're going to find some evidence to back it up. But, it's kind of like me, here's the data show. To me, the best way to explain it is a global flood. And there's plenty of evidence. It grinds you that these guys say there's no evidence.
We're standing on it, like you said.
Yeah, most people are standing on it. It's like, how do you explain that?
Wow. And I think in light of what you're saying here, this is why it's so important to do what you've done with the geology textbook, if I remember correctly, at Liberty University, because you're showing both sides of the equation. There we go.
I don't know if that shows up backwards.
Let's have a look at that.
It's backwards.
That's great. And that's what we need people, because I know growing up, before I got saved at around 27, 28. I was unfamiliar. I was never presented in all those years of school, high school, college, any of this evidence. And so for you to have a textbook there where it shows both sides, but then it highlights the evidence for young earth creation and a global Genesis flood, that is fascinating to most objective thinking people, Dr. Clarey.
Yeah, it has some of the maps of my 6 continents with the data in there. I mean, it isn't the big thrust of that book, but it's in the chapter on Earth history. So I talk about the evolutionary Earth history story, and then I get into, okay, here's what what we think the rocks represent, the different stages of the flood. And that explains the rocks and the fossil record the best.
Yeah.
And so it is, and a lot of the students in there, they went to Christian schools all their lives. They said, we never heard any of this.
Right.
They don't hear the young earth. There's very few Christian schools in the States or in the world that actually teach young earth. And Liberty still does. And so we're really thankful that we got this out. It's an ebook as well. You can order it a little cheaper as an ebook at icr.org if anybody really wants to get the ebook. Or you can get the textbook at icr.org as well. But I think it's on sale right now.
Well, perfect time.
So it's a little pricier than most of our books because it's a college textbook, and it was an intensive effort by our communications editors and myself and Jake Hebert, and it took about a little over a year to get this done, but we did it really quick. And there's a couple of little minor errors, eight or so little errors we're going to fix in the second printing of it. We're going to fix the ebook of that hopefully. But what do you expect for a first edition?
Right.
But it turned out really, really well. Nobody really notices those too much. It's just still a typo here or there. But overall, it turned out amazingly better than I even thought, better than I dreamed. So it's and the students that are using it are and there's some high schools that are using it. A few of them picked it up because it's written at a low enough level that you can, I think even a junior high kid could understand most of it, but high school for sure.
Well, I love it. That's awesome, Dr. Clarey. So, all right, let's get some of these questions in here from our critics. We do like to plant some seeds, get people thinking. Actually, I'll start with this one. So, every slide that you presented, brother, generated discussion. So, a lot of the questions that came in, you actually answered as you moved along in your presentation. So, possibly we could just clarify or reiterate a couple points.
Okay.
So, Andrew coming here in the chat again. We do appreciate our critics. We're hoping to plant some seeds here, and so he's wondering. And this was early on in your talk, maybe within the first 5 to 10 minutes. And so he's wondering, why would a global flood fluctuate like that? We don't see any floods today or in the recent rock record doing that.
I think that goes back to the way the seafloor was being created. I think it was pulses, and John Baumgartner, Dr. Baumgartner, is working on that with some more of his models. He's trying to get almost like a pulsing going on. And we don't see it today because the floods today are local floods. Floods today are, you get a heavy rainstorm, you get a flash flood, or you get a big flood, a bunch of rain in the springtime here in the States and in Canada. When snow melts, April and May, you often get a lot of big flooding. But those are just local floods. They're not the whole world. They're not affecting Europe. They're not affecting everywhere else. But I think a lot of it, and again, I don't know the exact answers. I imagine that it has to do with something with these seafloor ridges that we see around up and down the ocean. Every ocean has a ridge, and right now they're very narrow. During the flood year, things went faster, things pushed up and went a little wider. So there might have been some pulsing as the way the continents were moving around and maybe bumping into each other a little bit as they moved. You might have had some of these seafloor things going up faster, and then they kind of went down again a little bit, and then they went down a little bit faster and went down a little bit. And it ends up you have 5 major pulses going up each time, except for maybe the second one, going a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, and then eventually the last one is the receding phase. And I think it has something to do with almost like the ocean, the ridges, almost like breathing. Going faster, they would push up more and spread down. If they slow down a little bit, they kind of collapse. And I don't think you'd expect to see an exact same speed throughout. Just like when you're driving across town, you may have an average speed of 40 miles an hour driving across town, but you hit a lot of lights on the way. Maybe you're going 70 at different times, and so but your average speed. So I think it's just a consequence of the fluctuation, and I've got to look into that more. Was there any sort of plate tectonics reason why? Maybe when you're ripping out from like certain continents, you might have caused the plates to go faster suddenly and then slow down if they were hitting each other. But that's a very good question. I don't have a good answer to, but I think it can be explained away by kind of fluctuations in the amount of seafloor being created and the speed of it kind of varying a little bit.
I think that's a good answer, but that's also the fun and joy and excitement of model building. If we had every single answer down perfectly today, December 2025, I mean, what are we going to look forward to in the coming years? So, but I think we're getting a handle on the big picture, but there's so much more we got to look into. There's so much we got to do we don't understand, like you said. Well, that's good. So I'm kind of curious for myself. We engage a lot of critics here, do debates, open mic, stuff like that. And we'll get a lot of old earth creationists in here challenging our points on the flood. And typically what they'll say as a more basic rebuttal to the evidence of this worldwide strata, sedimentary rock layers extending over entire continents, correlating them worldwide, so on and so forth. They'll say, well, what explains that better than the young earth creation model, Dr. Clarey, is, and you kind of touched on this throughout your talk, many local floods, not at the same time, but just over millions of years, are explaining what we would look at and explain through a 1-year global flood. What would be a good way to address that or rebut that?
Well, again, it kind of goes back to what I talked about earlier. When you see these layers being deposited in between these sequences, they're supposed to be tens of millions of years sometimes. Why is there no erosion? Why is there no erosion? Why do these layers come on top of each other flat? They're perfectly like the layers in Grand Canyon. The Muav limestone, they're supposed to be Cambrian, the Sauk mega sequence. And you right on top of that, in most of the Grand Canyon, we see the red wall limestone, the big red, thick cliff making layer in the middle of Grand Canyon. There's supposed to be 160 million years of time missing between them, but everywhere you see them, it's like two bricks laid right on top of each other for hundreds of miles in all directions, and that continues across the continents. Wow. So to me, the evidence is there that where's the erosion? Nowhere in the world today do we see flat erosion that covers entire continents. I mean, that just doesn't happen today. And that happened, it would have happened over and over and over and over between every rock layer, pretty much, that you see in front of you. There's almost no change. There's no gullies, there's no rivers. Grand Canyon is supposed to be, they estimate now, 6 million years old. Well, if you're looking at 160 million years, shouldn't there be a lot of canyons cut into that lower limestone layer that filled in with something else, and then eventually you brought something in flat on the top? And layer upon layer upon layer, that's the pattern we see. And to me, that argues against a lot of time in between those layers, that very little amount of time, you just maybe weeks or days, and you put one layer on top of the other. So these numbers they throw around, these 160 million years of missing time or 500 million years, even the great unconformity at the bottom, it's pretty much flat. There's a few little undulations here and there, but something planed those off. And that's one thing we need to look at more, is what do tsunami waves really do? How do they erode and how do they deposit? We think tsunamis were doing this because you're having this rapid plate movement, but exactly how they did it is something that needs a lot of research as well. But to me, the argument that dispels what you're asking is the continuous layers that are perfectly flat. And the next layer comes down perfectly flat. And that's the pattern we see through 95% of the rock record. There's only a few spots where you have uplifts and you cause a little turmoil going on. And even those areas, you see rapid deposition, flat layers on top of that again. So to me, it's the things they don't talk about in school. They don't talk about that, as I mentioned earlier. Why are these layers still so flat? Just like you layer in bricks, and there's no evidence of time. The rocks don't tell you time. You can look at the patterns and go, okay, what's the most reasonable explanation? You would say those were layered right on top of each other with no time missing. But yet evolutionary scientists come in and say, oh no, there's millions of years of time between this layer and this layer. And you're like, where? Where's the gullies? Where's the rivers and the valleys? Everywhere in the Earth's surface today is covered with valleys and gullies, and even Grand Canyon. There should be all sorts of things filled in that should just be chaos. And even a lot of the layers, the clay layers, are now finding clay, the most common sedimentary rock of all, is deposited by moving water. When you look at flume experiments in the laboratories, to get the clay layers that have these little fine laminations in, like we see in the rock record, you have to have moving water. So things aren't slowly settling out of solution like they try to tell you. That's not how clays were deposited to make the rocks that we see. Same thing with limestone by moving water. Flume experiments are revealing a lot when you try to mimic what the rocks really show. And then when you look at the different layers on top of each other, you can actually deposit several layers at once, horizontally coming in. That you can show that with flumes as well. And we show some of that in our laboratories here at ICR. To me, it's the flat-lying layers on flat-lying layers with no evidence of erosion. Tells me these were deposited very quickly on top of each other.
That's an excellent answer. That's what I call a clip-worthy moment, Dr. Clarey. So that's what we'll do with that. Perfect. I appreciate that. We like to make smaller clips of the longer videos, answering common challenges. That's perfect. Okay, here we go. Next one. We've actually got, well, at least one. Howard in the chat says he's coming at this from he's a geologist, so he's got some, some challenges here. Geologist versus geologist. So he's wondering, Please explain the extensive river channels and soils in the Morrison Formation in Utah and Colorado without a hint of marine fossils for 1,000 kilometers.
Well, I don't know if that's, it depends on what you call a marine fossil. Sometimes some of these, there are a lot of clams and things like that they, and many times they say these are non-marine clams. Like you'll get animals like the coelacanth fish in Morocco with dinosaurs, and they say, well, the coelacanth fish must have been a freshwater fish back then. And so sometimes it's a matter of, what are you saying these animals are? And there are, what's interesting about the Morrison Formation, there's some chert layers in there, thin chert layers that are extensive. And you can go through the literature and look these up. Back in the 60s, the USGS geologists were finding this amazingly extensive chert layer I talked about in one of my articles on the Dinosaur National Monuments, the geology of that. There is evidence of marine critters in a lot of these, but they're always like the Green River fish. Those are herring. Most of the fish in the Green River are herring, and there's marine rays. But there, of course, these must have been freshwater herring back then. These must have been freshwater rays back then. These must have been freshwater sharks that they find with T-Rex, 6 different species of sharks. And so to say it's not a hint of marine fossils sometimes is it's subjective. But let's talk about the river channels. There's supposedly river channels in there. You can see some channeling going on. But as these waves are coming in and going back, you're going to get some channeling occasionally. So I don't have a problem with some channels, but they're not quite river channels like we're seeing, because the Morrison, there's some of the layers of the Morrison are very consistent for miles and miles and miles. You see the same colors. I've dug dinosaurs in the Morrison. You can identify it by the colors alone, but these same clay layers go for miles in all directions. You don't really see channels hardly anywhere in the Morrison. And you have these chert layers. Chert only forms in the ocean. Geologists still trying to figure out how chert forms. It's a quartz, microcrystalline type of quartz you make like flint or arrowheads out of flint or chert. But when you deposit it, it has to be underwater. And in many cases, right below the Morrison in Wyoming, there's a site, I believe it's can't think of the name of it now, Red something Canyon. It's a new site of dinosaur footprints. And it's in the Sundance, which below is full of marine critters. And everybody in Wyoming, and when you study out there like I did, they say, oh, this is a marine rock, because the marine rock is full of marine critters. Well, there's dinosaurs walking right on top of it, stepping on the shrimp burrows. And the limestone they're walking on, which is a marine rock, is rippled. There were waves. And the same thing happened. I just wrote a story that's going to come out at ICR.org on 18,000 footprints, dinosaur footprints in Bolivia. I just discovered a few weeks ago and announced, and published a paper on it. And it's got marine ripples, and they're walking in limestone again. Why are these dinosaurs walking in limestone? That's a marine rock. That's an ocean rock. It really rarely forms in lakes the way we see it. It's the purity, but it's the continuity of these layers, these individual, purple layers, the individual white layers, individual chert layers that go for across the entire Morrison, the extent of the Morrison. The continuity of it from one end to the other, how you can identify it across from Canada all the way down to New Mexico, to me, screams that this was a deposit all at once, that there were no soils. That people talk about soils. They talk about paleosols a lot, they call them. Yeah. And they interpret them that way, mostly because they see red, they see different colors, but you never see rooting in those. You don't see the roots going down. The bottoms of coal seams, you don't see roots going down. Where these plants grew in place. You just see a flat layer and a flat layer right on top. I can show you pictures of, bottoms and tops of coal seams. Go look them up. There's no rooting going on. So most of these paleo soils, they call them, or ancient soils, are interpretation, which I don't think they don't look like soils we see today. You don't see intensive rooting and plant roots that should be in there. You may get some plants here and there. You do get some trees and plants in the Morrison. I've dug dinosaurs with trees right next to them. They're kind of turned to coal, but they're always knocked down. And everything looks like a real catastrophic rapid burial, ripping the dinosaurs apart. Rarely finding complete dinosaurs. It's the way it is in the whole world. You rarely find anything complete. It's just ripped apart. Different species, bones laying on top of each other. And to me, those chert layers, the extent of these layers that go across from one state to the next, the same exact colors, same order of burial is in their clay layers. And it goes from one end to the, basically north to south across the American West. To me, screams that this is all one deposit. So I don't really believe you can interpret some of those things as soils if you want, but I want you to show me why these are a soil and not just a layer that was deposited by water. And again, some of the things that they claim are non-marine fossils, actually in many places are found today in the world in the oceans. But not every layer does show marine fossils, I'll give them that. But the Morrison has marine chert in it. So there's thin layers of chert that are found. I actually have a piece of it over here somewhere. My boss's land, he has land with the Morrison. We're digging dinosaurs on that up in Wyoming. And he's got some chert on that. It's about this thick. And according to the evolutionary articles, there's a chert layer that covers multiple states in the Morrison, one continuous chert layer. How do you explain that without ocean environment? How do you explain that? So you might interpret things as channels, but there's really very few things that would be a real channel in the Morrison. And the soils are the same way. Very few things that would really look like today's modern soils without all the tree rooting and vegetation you'd expect in there. And even the animals. You don't see a lot of burrowing in many of these rocks. There should be bioturbation should be everywhere. Distributing all the sediments like the bottom of the oceans today and the bottom of the lakes. You see all these animals burrowing down, destroying but we see thin layers, even in the Morrison, that go for as far as you can see in all directions, and they actually go hundreds of miles. Why isn't it all chewed up if these things have been sitting there for eons of time, or even hundreds of years or thousands of years, or even 5 years, or even a year? You can have everything's going to be all disturbed, and you can get these little thin layers. So, it's out of it's what you're taught. You're taught these are soils, you believe they're soils. You're taught these are channels, you believe they're river channels. But the evidence isn't strong that the Morrison is deposited by rivers, because you should see individual sand layers surrounded by lots of clay. You don't really see that, maybe in a couple of spots. But for the most part, it's just continuous clays, continuous sands, whatever it is.
Okay, that's a really good answer and really interesting. So if I'm understanding you correctly, because we have a follow-up from Howard, and he says, well, there are thousands of river channels in the Morrison Formation, but you're saying they're interpreting those as river channels, but there's not really good evidence for there being thousands, like he's saying.
Right. I don't, again, it depends on who's calling it a river channel. Is a river channel had to move all the way across laterally to deposit a continuous layer? Is that what he's calling a river channel? There is evidence of some channeling going on when these layers are being deposited. But in terms of a true river channel, you would expect to see mostly clay with just a few isolated sand channels in there. And to my knowledge of the Morrison, seeing it wherever I've studied it, all around Wyoming, Colorado, and different places in Wyoming, I've never really seen a river channel. I'd like to go out in the field and see these with Howard so he can show them to me. But you don't pick up an article about the Morrison Formation. They don't say, oh, look at those river channels. They'll interpret it as deposited by rivers. But to actually find the channels, you have to spread the sand across great areas. And even like the Mississippi River doesn't do that today. You see a valley, notched down, and eventually it's in this little narrow area where it's meandering around. You don't see that. To me, you see extensive layers that cover multiple states. Same layer, same layer, same layer. That's not what rivers do. But I'm willing to go in the field and we'll take a look. But I've seen the Morrison in many places. I've never seen river channels. Not that I haven't been looking for them. And the same thing is true of the paleosols. I've been on a lot of field trips with people telling me these are soils, but a lot of it's because they have iron in them and things like that. Oh, this is a soil. And it fits the story, but it doesn't have the ingredients to be a true soil. I don't think these are true river channels in the Morrison either, that you'd get from a river with lots of plants on the side. And it's interpretive license. That's what you're taught. But I'd like to go in the field and actually have a look.
That's good. No, I appreciate that. It makes sense. Dr. Clarey, great answer. Okay, so here's one from Sydney Raptor. I've seen this challenge over the years as well. So we'll see what's a good way to, I guess, engage it. So he's asking, can Dr. Clarey please explain how marine, aeolian, and fluvial strata are interbedded in much of the western interior of the U.S.? Different environments in one flood? ?
Yeah. Again, it goes back to what you were taught. If you believe the Coconino sandstone and the 10 slate sandstone, which are basically equivalent, if you believe those are aeolian, wind-blown dunes, then of course you're going to say this. And that's why the overall sea level curve goes way down, jumps way up. The secular curve does, then it goes way down, and it's really dry in the middle, and then comes back up again. That's because of the Permian sands across the American West, from the Coconino all the way up to the Ten Sleep. It's really one big sand layer through the Lions in Colorado Springs and that sort of thing. They all show cross beds. But when you measure the angles of these cross beds, like John Whitmore did, thousands of angles, him and his students, they find out that these angles in these cross beds, they're supposedly aeolian or windblown. The range of the cross beds are too narrow. Aeolian sands are between about 5 degrees and about 40 degrees. You get all sorts of numbers with almost a bimodal distribution. Whereas the water sands are very narrow, between 18 and 20 degrees, and they're much, tighter range than the aeolian sands, which are much greater, a lot of them greater than 30-degree angles. So one thing you can do is measure a lot of angles of these things. And when you measure a lot of them, they fit better with water waves. Secondly, in the Coconino, particularly, John Whitmore has found dolomite ooids. Any geologist knows an ooid can only form in open sea, rolling around these little balls of carbonate that build up almost like a snowball, but tiny little things in like the Bahamas today. And they're dolomite. And so dolomite, you're not going to get these in lakes. These are going to only be ocean ooids. So you've got these dolomite ooids mixed in the Coconino sandstone that they discovered by looking at thin sections and thin sections and thin sections from my friends up in Calgary, Ray Strom and Stephen Chang, who did all these thin sections for John, and they did a lot of work when they mapped all these and took samples all over Arizona. To me, to say these things are aeolian just because they're big sand dunes, and that's pretty much the evolutionary community says, is not really looking at the data intense enough. So when you look at the data intense enough, the angles of the crossbeds fit better with water waves. The things we're finding in there, including dolomite layers. There's dolomite layers, actually beds of dolomite in the Coconino as well. And so to me, the argument is, how do you get these, everything shows marine. And to me, the challenge that I want to see is why you say these are fluvial. Why do you say these are river systems? Because like I told Howard, I like to see these when you get to the Morrison. And then as I mentioned, you've got the Sundance Formation, which everybody says is marine. And you got dinosaurs running around on top of it. You're leaving footprints. How do you explain that away? Why were they? And they don't know what these dinosaurs were. They're three-toed dinosaurs. They look like allosaurs. But of course, they say they can't be allosaurs because allosaurs didn't evolve until 17 million years later. But yet you find them in the next rock layer right above the Sundance. 5 miles away, you find almost complete specimens of allosaurs. And so they made the footprints. They got buried in the next wave. Boom. There's the answer. There's no 17 million years of time in between again because the layers are flat on top of each other. There's no evidence of 17 million years of time. But again, why would dinosaurs be running around the water? Same thing is true in Bolivia. They're running around in limestone. Here in Texas, we got dinosaur footprints in Glen Rose. They're walking around in limestone again. Why are they walking around in limestone? They're trying to find some land as the waves are coming in and they get displaced. They left their last prints and then they were washed away in the next wave somewhere else. And to me, you don't have differences. You don't have marine, aeolian, and fluvial. You have just waves coming in, bringing in marine critters, washing them in, going higher and higher and higher. So in effect, it's all marine. It's all deposited by water. The evidence for these aeolian sandstones, the onus is on them to show otherwise. But when you look at the thin sections, we see minerals that only can be deposited in water, like in the Coconino, and we see dolomite beds. We see, again, the angles. When you measure thousands of angles, like John Whitmore did all across, and he shows that the whole system, that whole system from, again, covers about the same as the Morrison, goes to Wyoming all the way down to Arizona. It all has similar crossbed directions. Everything's kind of flowing all the same direction across that whole region, as if it was deposited all at once. And the evolutionary community doesn't talk about that either. And so we're finding more and more as we have our few workers work in creation science, we're finding powerful things to show that these rocks are not deposited in dry arid dunes. These are not deposited in what you call traditional river systems. These are all deposits of the flood coming in, pushing these waves in. But if you believe the evolutionary depositional environments, of course you're going to reinterpret them how you want them to fit. But looking at the rocks doesn't support it.
Wow, this is really good stuff. The chat's making me sweat. It's very energetic in light of all of these excellent points.
On this follow-up here, I want to hear Andrew explain, how does he know the wind-blown sand dunes? So what does he say? What's the feature in there that explains you the wind-blown sand dunes? Because the crossbed angles, when you do hundreds or thousands of them, they fit better with what we see in water sands today.
So I guess his pushback would be, well, fluvial cross bedding doesn't get as high as 20 or 30 degrees.
Well, I disagree with that. You do see it. You can talk to John Whitmore about that more and get him on the show. He can explain it in painstaking detail, where he's measured thousands and thousands of these along with the students. And maybe we're not talking necessarily fluvial. We're talking water waves into the bottom of the ocean. So again, you got to take the fluvial out of it. Today's modern dunes may not, say crossbeds may not show that, but we do see water dunes basically around 17 to 20. There's a few that get maybe up to 30, but he found most of them all peak almost like a bell curve. Most of them are all between 17 and 20 for the water waves. So I agree, rarely do they get 30 degrees. If it's 30 degrees or above, those are aeolian. And we don't see that in these. And so right here, his statement, fluvial doesn't get as high as 20 or 30. That tells you it's not aeolian, where we map these as well, because that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing everything very tight, 17 to 20 degrees, with just a few outliers, whereas aeolian sands are way out here, 40 degrees to 5 degrees and everything in between. But they peak in a couple of modes. It's like everything around that. You get more above 30 in aeolian sands. You don't see that in the 10 slate sandstone. You don't see it above 30 like you'd expect to see in an aeolian sand in the Coconino. They're all much, much lower for the most part, except for a few outliers. But again, it's taken enough measurements to really get a true bell curve to lay out that really tells the difference. And again, you got to explain to the dolomite. How do you get dolomite ooids? Of all things, not just layers of dolomite, thin layers of dolomite. You got to get old dolomite ooids mixed in the sand grains. And the sand grains are bimodal. They're not all one size. He found, the more he studied these and went through the analysis, and he found flakes of muscovite in there. And he did studies with water with muscovite, spinning it around for days. Nothing happened to the muscovite with water. When he did it with wind, that muscovite was chewed up within a day. And the muscovite flakes are still there all over. They're ubiquitous in the Coconino sandstone, these flakes of muscovite. So how do you have all these really good preserved flakes of muscovite if this wasn't deposited by water? Because again, empirical studies show that muscovite gets chewed up by wind very, very quickly within a day or so. It's gone. Yet it's all over, which fits better because this was deposited by water. So there's a lot of things, not just the crossbed angles. But when you're going to school, they just teach you all these, Zion National Park, look at these big crossbeds. And they just say it's aeolian. There's no, they just don't want to think about water waves were that big to make water, some of those ones we saw in Zion National Park, to get crossbeds that thick and that extensive, you'd have to have water 500 foot high. Well, in the flood, that's not a problem. But for your evolutionary scientist who wants to make everything uniform, that's a big issue. So they have to say this is big sand dunes. But again, the angles don't match up. And the things inside the sands all are screaming water, water, water.
Wow. Excellent job with those objections, Dr. Clarey. You're an encyclopedia of information.
And you can get raindrop prints. Occasionally when the waves were going in, they would back off, and there'd be moments where the land would be exposed for hours or maybe a day or two before the next waves came in. So I don't have a problem with raindrop prints. I've seen a few. There's not very many. And ripples, again, to make crossbeds, you get ripples, whether it's wind blown or water blown. I think the crossbeds, all for the most part, what I've seen, and what John Whitmore has done, is these are water crossbeds, so therefore they were water ripples as well. You get, symmetrical, asymmetrical. The waves are going in and out as these waves are washing in, washing out. All these things can be, readily explained by the flood as well. It's the same processes. You're going to have moments when some of the land was exposed for a while. That's when these animals might have come across and trampled on them, and then the next waves came in. You have to bury these things. You have to bury their ripples. How do you bury their ripples if you're leaving them there exposed for eons of time? How do you preserve ripples? How do you preserve the footprints? How do you preserve this unless they're buried quickly again with the next wave? And so to me, ripples in the rock layers, footprints, all these things are an argument against the old Earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my thoughts.
How do you preserve raindrop prints? Why would you preserve a raindrop print? How many are being preserved today?
Right.
How many ripples are being preserved? They're constantly moving. But if you just stopped them and buried them with something else, maybe you could preserve them. But you got to have rapid burial of all these features to preserve them all. And we see them all over. Billions of fossils that Fossils aren't being made today. An animal dies, it decays at the bottom of the ocean, it gets eaten. But if you're burying things fast with more and more sedimentation rapidly coming in, you're going to preserve the fossils, the footprints, the ripples, all these things, raindrop prints. All these things better explained by rapid deposition, rapid burial. Fossils today, you got to bury things fast and deep to make a fossil. Even Mary Schweitzer said that at a lecture here in Dallas a few years back. She admits that you got to bury things fast and deep because you run over a deer, what's going to happen to it? You hit a deer, you run over a squirrel, they don't become fossils. They have to be buried fast and sometimes deep enough to really cut off the oxygen level enough to preserve most of the animal. And so the depth can vary a little bit from place to place. If it's really like a muddy bog, like we see a lot of Ice Age fossils in Michigan and mixed in clays, and in Ontario as well, mixed in clay, you get a lot of mastodons, a few of their bones, but they're not as preserved as well as they are in Siberia when they're frozen.
Is there an application here to what Michael J. Ord describes as the beds hypothesis?
A little bit. I mean, I think there are some moments when the waves are coming in and going back, and he makes a point about that, what he calls these, I forget how it goes, something exposed. I forget what stands for.
Briefly exposed.
Yeah. So I think there were some moments where you had some of the land exposed or just with a little bit of water, and a lot of animals are running through that, like the dinosaurs in Wyoming going across the limestone. It was rippled, by the way, rippled limestone, which it means the limestone is being deposited by moving water, just like in Bolivia, and they're walking and leaving their footprints. And you can go see this. It's right over there on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains, just into Wyoming, I think near Shell Canyon. There's a site called the Red something, I forget the name of it. But, how do you preserve those footprints unless you bury them fast? How do you, any footprint or anything? So again, we don't have all the answers. I'll admit it. Sometimes we need to go out in the field more and see more rocks. And so I'd be willing to go out with Howard in the field and look at these. You can send me some pictures and, you can get a hold of me at ICR. You can send it to our contacts at ICR. Send me the pictures of these channels where there's hundreds, and I guess he said how many hundreds or thousands of channels. I haven't seen them. And I've been all around the American West and Wyoming in different basins and looking at the Morrison dinosaur digging and things like that as well.
Well, I think you're doing a great job responding. Lots of questions and challenges for the secularists, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Looks like we got a follow-up here from Howard.
This is a good one. That's a good question. How do we know the same sequences from continent to continent without marine biostratigraphy? Well, if you put together Pangea, you can line up a lot of these rocks and you can see the same rock layers extended across from one to the next. If I had put my rock layers the way they were the early sequences, everything's pretty much together. And it wasn't until the Abserica you really started breaking things apart for the most part. And so you can actually map them. Sloss himself took his sequences from North America and he mapped them in South America, and he found almost the same thing. He mapped them over into the Russian platform, in the European part of Russia. He mapped them over there. So he already correlated the sequences, the same mega sequences, and the erosional boundaries between them. He was able to correlate those across 3 major continents right there. So it wasn't that difficult to go to the next continent. And so you do use the fossils. There's no way to eliminate completely fossils, but I've looked at salt layers. I have a paper on this that I put out at the ICC, the International Conference on Creationism in 2018, I think it is. And talking about the paleo environments and my interpretation of the pre-flood world. I talk about the validation of the geologic column. It really is a global geologic column because it was a global flood. That's really expect to find. So people even creationists argue against that. But the salt layers and things we see, these things that have nothing to do with fossils, we can find these salt layers that go from New York all the way across to Michigan. And you can find chert layers that go across to Arkansas and Mississippi and some of these areas down there in the Tippecanoe that go across. And you can map those out and they actually will stay right in between the mega sequences. So it validates the mega sequences. They don't cut across the mega sequences. They stay right in line where they're supposed to be. So the mega sequences here, these chert and salt layers go right along with them. And so to me, that validates, at least on a regional scale, the validity of these mega sequence boundaries, that you can correlate them even without fossils. In many places, as long as you have enough data points, you can correlate. And when you jump continents, where these continents were together, you can kind of work your way around to where they were still attached. You can jump from continent to continent as well. You don't have to worry about what's in the ocean today. That was forming new and you can't really correlate the ocean to the continents in a lot of cases, except on the edges. So I went on the edge of the continents, but I didn't go around across the ocean to correlate. I just went to, we did use the stratigraphy, the fossils. But again, even when I looked at, okay, what if we didn't have fossils, at least in parts of North America, I could follow the unusual rock types like chert layers that were extensive bedded chert, which again can't be explained very well by the evolutionary community. And all these gypsum layers and salt layers, the extensive layers that go from across several states, they all paralleled the mega sequences. So I think you can validate the mega sequences that way. And again, the evolutionary guys like Lawrence Sloss have correlated a couple of continents as well in 1972, I think it was. So it can be done, and I did it. To me, it makes a lot of sense.
And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Clarey, in your talk and in your articles, you've also answered largely what we see in terms of the ordering of the fossil record by your mega sequence data, where you focus on at first the early, smaller mega sequences,
less extensive ones.
And then your middle mega sequences basically coinciding with the peak of the flood. And then later, so is there a correlation with the fossils that we find in the layers?
Oh yeah, it's perfectly done. And my colleague, if I can find his book over here, Dr. Tompkins, he wrote a book. I might have given it away. He wrote a book at ICR that talks about that, how he tied all the fossils. It really, the best explanation, again, a lot of details need to be worked out, is ecological zones.
Right.
And so early on, you're only flooding the same limited areas of North Africa, same limited areas of United States, mostly in North America and some of Western Canada, same areas of Europe going across Central Europe, over and over and over like pancakes, just in those limited areas. And each one of those first three sequences pretty much shows just marine fossils. And so you're looking at, I interpret that means those are shallow seas. And you don't see dinosaurs, you don't see all these other animals at the time until later. And it's globally. All of a sudden, boom, all around the world you see coal. All around the world, boom, you see land animals in great numbers mixed with marine critters. And so why would every continent do the same thing unless the water was going higher? Now you're flooding a different environment.
Right.
And that explains these extinctions, I think, as well. So these mega sequence boundaries sometimes don't always line up with these so-called big extinctions, but they're in the middles of them where the water was peaking in those sequences and then going back and forth. So each sequence, there's thousands and thousands of individual tsunamis, and they're interacting, and the geometry of almost tsunami adding and subtracting to each other, wave interference, if you want to call it that. If we could model all that out, it just gets to the point where it's too complicated to try to see. But that's what gives us all these individual layers. But each layer goes great distances because they're deposited over vast areas each time. It's like the nautiloid bed at the bottom of the Red Wall limestone. It goes across a couple states. And they're all kind of pointing generally in the same direction as if they were pushed in one big flow. And that's what is the best explanation of the data. So if you get the idea out of old Earth, young Earth, and all that stuff out of your head, and you look at just what the rocks show, it's very revealing.
It's amazing research. I mean, every time I hear you talk on it, it just and what your research does is it really strengthens the faith of believers. And Howard, based on what you're saying here on the tsunamis, what would be a good response to this?
Okay. Well, the coral reefs in the Silurian and Permian, yeah, I've looked at those. In Michigan, there's supposed to be coral reefs and things like that, and I've seen busted up corals. We've drilled into these corals, and a lot of these are just coral debris. In Michigan, I can show you pictures I've published at ICR, some articles. There's big Petoskey stones, our state stone, which is a coral, and it's in the rock layer in this quarry, and they're upside down, big chunks of it, like 3 feet, 1 meter long of Petoskey, and they're big hunks of it just upside down, and they're mixed with all this other debris. So I don't, again, they interpret these as reefs because they are thinking uniformitarian, but really this is just reef debris. Many of these are corals that were deposited and busted up. When you look at the big picture in the outcrops, you'll see the story is this is a very violent burial even in these limestones. That these are not really true reefs like we would imagine out there in the world today, where reefs are building off, in these offshore areas like Australia's Great Barrier Reef and the reefs around Florida and places like that. These are evidence of rapid burial. When you really look at the data, there's a lot of reef debris. But sometimes these get mounded up. There's these mounds we were chasing, these so-called bioherms with Chevron in North Texas. back when I first started with the company, and there's just a big pile of debris, but when you cored through it, it was just all jumbled up mess. But you do get some piles from the waves coming and going that will build up certain piles of debris that broke off. And again, it's all in the interpretation. Same data, but when you look at, I said in my home state of Michigan, the state fossil, state stone, state fossil is the mass stone, state stone is the potassium stone, which is a coral. You see them upside down. I mean, why would you? And they would, people often say that's part of a reef and that broke off, but there's no real, what I would call a reef like we see today. These are always different. There's a lot of broken up. And I agree, many of the reefs may be in growth position. They might be right side up, but I don't think you're looking at, these extensive deposits. Again, these are buried in, you can't really, to me, I don't think they're true reefs. And so Howard needs to send me some of these.
He's enjoying the discussion.
I can send him some that are upside down just as well. And so it's, you can go back and forth, just like you can argue about channels in the Morrison, but or not. I really don't think there are that many. But Howard apparently gets around. So, and I've looked at a lot of geology over the world, and again, I can't explain everything, but the ones I've seen, I don't really think. I think you can alternatively interpret these as just piles of reef debris. And some of these may end up just like the trees, that settle out at Mount St. Helens. The big heavy stumps are going down, which is a good analogy for what we see at Yellowstone. All these trees that are going down, and they're basically rootless. I was just last summer, I was up in Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, looking at all these tree stumps, and there's pictures of them where they're tilted and they're perfectly flat. Even the evolutionary papers say, well, these trees are all in growth position, their stumps are down, but they're tilted, some of them, but there's no roots. I'm like, well, that should tell you that there's something, these things settled in there. They didn't grow there. Yet that's their argument they make. They even point out there's no roots. They're just the heavier side sank down, but some of them are tilted at angles. I published a paper on this when at ICR. You can see my article on Theodore Roosevelt National Park up by Medora, North Dakota. And it's amazing. I mean, these things are just, there's nothing. They're cut right off, and they're tilted sometimes. They came down tilted. Sometimes they came down straight. And that's what we see at Yellowstone as well. And we see that at Mount St. Helens. These logs that were tripped off, the heavier stuff sank to the bottom. Some of them got waterlogged. And again, the heaviest side is going to be where the roots were ripped out, and you just see the thicker part of the stump goes down first. And so we do see that. But again, we look at coal seams, you might get an occasional log cut across them, but you don't see any roots even on those trees. Go to Joggins Cliffs out there in Nova Scotia, I think it is. I was out there years ago, and same sort of thing. The trees there's no roots on those trees. And so, show me the roots to support that real soil underneath those coal seams. And you don't see that. You see flat coal seam top, flat coal seam bottom, with no evidence of rooting going on at all. So
when you mention these,
it's we can go around in circles, but the best way to look at it is to actually go look at the rocks and get out there and look at each other in the field. And you're going to get two geologists together like Howard and I, and you're never going to agree, even on the interpretation of. I mapped to published a paper on a fault in Wyoming that I think moved catastrophically fast, which was overridden. What was caused by the Heart Mountain Fault, which is a famous fault in Wyoming that people are trying to figure out. And everybody agrees that moved maybe 100 miles an hour as it moved catastrophically. Well, as it landed, I think it squished the freshly deposited sediments and caused this other fault to move out from underneath it, kind of like the way thrust faults kind of progress in Western Canada from, in the direction of these faults move, they go youngest, they get younger in the direction of transport. And that's when I used to work the thrust belt. It's because these sediments were still soft. They're compressing water in there, and water can't stay there for millions of years. This overpressured water, it slips away, and once it slips away, it's done. And then you can't redo it. It has to be, to get all these tight folds at the end, we see as well, that has to be, they still have to be somewhat soft. And so the challenge there was a lot of geologists didn't believe it. They didn't want to believe this was fast because of these tight folds, but most geologists actually agreed with me, but there were still a few that realized, if these move fast, that means these rocks had to be folded fast. That can't happen because it was supposed to be, 200 million years later that this actually, or 150 million years, 100 million years later to be exact. So Jurassic rocks were folded really tightly and supposedly have moved, the Eocene. So you're looking at about 100 million years of evolutionary time where they say these rocks should have all been solid. And yet they did it at the surface. these things were pushed up to the surface like thrust faults do. How do you fold these rocks if they're not fully lithified? And so that's another big argument that creationists make. And I think it's a valid argument. You see rocks in Grand Canyon, you see folds all over. You see folds that supposedly happened 70 million years ago, or actually after that, in the Laramide, 50, 60 million years ago. Folding rocks are supposed to be 450 million years old. Well, how do you fold them still when they're, supposedly almost 400 million years of time, when they should have been all solid rock? How do they still fold and make nice? Well, sure, they break a little bit, but to fold rocks, you got to really be super deep, way down in the ductile zone, well below, but these were near the surface when these things happened. They weren't that deep, or you got to fold them really slowly, and you can't. And these thrust faults that I was talking about earlier, to move these big sheets of rock like we see it making the Canadian Rockies and Montana, northern Montana, Glacier National Park and Banff and all those areas, you can't maintain fluid pressure for millions of years to move these things slowly. And so the fluid pressure that allows those to move is going to dissipate, and it's not going to happen. So again, these kinds of things are not brought up when you take geology classes. They just say, look at these thrust faults that move slowly over millions of years. And look at the oil in Wyoming. It's 150 million years old. How can oil be 150 million years old? Think about that. Mm-hmm. Just sitting there waiting for us to tap into, sitting there for 150 million years. And the more I studied groundwater flow in Western Michigan, and you guys are a great school on groundwater there in Waterloo. Wonderful, wonderful research institution for groundwater. We studied a lot of your work when I was getting my PhD. You can't. There's groundwater everywhere. It's always moving. So you can, they argue that these were pasteurized somehow at 80 degrees Celsius, and they stayed that way for 150 million years magically. Well, you've got groundwater flow coming in all the time, bringing in new bacteria, and we've got bacteria over 3 miles deep. As far as we've drilled, the water still contains bacteria. So you're going to still cause biodegradation, and so you're going to biodegrade these oils away. They'll be gone within probably a few thousand years. They're not going to last. You put gasoline in your shed somewhere in your back or in your barn or wherever you have, leave it there for 30 years and try to use it. It's not going to work. It has an expiration date, essentially. It'll start to decay and break down. In the ground, it does the same thing. It just does it slower because there's not as much oxygen. So that's why you guys have the tar sands in Alberta, because that's biodegraded right down to tar. That's why most oil in Wyoming is very thick. It's a low gravity oil, they call it, because it's been biodegraded quite a bit, but it's not 150 million years old. It's just, but they teach all the geologists that when I was looking for oil there, that's what they tell you. They just say these things, but in reality, the reality of it is you got groundwater flow coming all the time. We can't dispose of any hazardous waste without it leaking somewhere. Everything leaks. That's why we're so afraid to get rid of our nuclear waste, because it's going to leak. Everything in the natural world leaks. It's just some are faster than others and some are slower than others, but everything's going to leak. And so even oil that's trapped in these rocks, they can't last that long. Oil, to me, oil is screaming young earth. Dinosaur soft tissues are screaming young earth. These deep cold slabs in the mantle screaming young earth. I mean, there's a lot of evidence for a young earth. And then all these layers stacked on top of each other, on and on and on. The flat coal seams, the flat beds, just like bricks on a wall. Where's the time?
Right.
You can do your radiometric dating all you want, but those are built on a lot of assumptions. And they assume, of course, that no water is moving in and out of the system, bringing in minerals. And most of these, I got rid of a lot of them because they're radioactive. Behind me, I have a lot of dinosaur bone pieces that I brought back from Wyoming, the junk. And they're radioactive. We put a Geiger count on, they're flipping off the scale because they're full of uranium that was moved by groundwater flow. Uranium is very soluble. So just to say, I know how much uranium was here originally. I know how much lead was here originally. That's ludicrous. When you study groundwater, which not many geologists do enough of, you realize everything's moving in and out of the system all the time. There's no closed system. And even these isochron, these curves that they do, they're mixing curves. You don't know what the end numbers are. And so there's a lot of problems with age dating. So don't just say they're this old because of that. Those are all built on a lot of assumptions that, of course, they assume this and this and this. And of course, it works. Look at that. And then they call it science. But they get the numbers they want. And there's a lot of numbers they have to toss out because they don't fit the system, the right age. They get 300 million. It's supposed to be 600 million. We sent samples off, found out there's a Precambrian rock layer, lava down there. They'd intruded in before the Tibet sandstone. Found out that was younger than the rock layer that flowed over the top of Grand Canyon if it was already carved, which would have been, in the Ice Age, very recent. And so you get numbers like that, and they say, well, those can't be right. But we sent them out to labs, through a third party. Nobody, knew the difference, but that's the numbers you get. Sometimes if you don't know, they'll give you the real numbers they get, but they're totally wrong. Even an evolutionist would say that's nonsense, but that's the numbers they came back at. Same rock sent to different labs, doing different tests, rubidium strontium versus uranium lead or something. You get numbers that are sometimes a couple orders of magnitude different. So you can't say just because, this rock gets the same age all the time. Age dates are very, very subjective, and I don't trust any of them because you can't go back in time and verify them.
Right.
How do you verify these ages? How do you really say dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago? No, wait, they changed that to 66. What's a million years between friends? Just recently they changed that. So a lot of people, we knew it was 65, and now the asteroid hit 66 million. But don't get me started on the asteroid. That's another whole talk. There's no crater there. Number one, there's no crater. That's a gravity anomaly, which is the most ambiguous type of geophysics you can possibly ever come up on. We didn't even use gravity with the oil company early because it's just hocus pocus nonsense. All it's telling you is different density rocks are there somewhere, whether they're deep, shallow. It all adds up to the signal. So there's sort of a semicircular feature. I think it's just two things overlapping.
So the Chicxulub, is that what it's called? That crater?
Chicxulub. Yeah, there's no crater. There's no crater there. There's just the gravity signal. They show you gravity maps all the time. They don't always tell you it's a gravity anomaly. I looked at all the oil wells, drilled into that as part of my research, and there's no iridium in the 10 wells. There are only 3 of the 10 wells showed any iridium, which is supposed to be the dust that went up.
Right.
And then another thing, there's almost no melted rock there. If that big impact, as big as they say, hit, there should have been 3 to 4 kilometers of melt. And in one well, we get 300 meters of melt. In the other well, we get about 100 meters. And that's pretty much it. The rest of them show almost nothing. So where's the heat generated from the impact? Where's the iridium? Where's the smoke from the smoking gun? Where's the crater? They shot seismic across it, and they try to say, oh, we proved this. I'm like, they just misinterpret their seismic. They just drilled into the basement, into the granite. They kept drilling granite for, I think, 500 feet. And all the fractures in that granite, all the pre-impact fractures that are sealed over with minerals, are still in the same orientation. They're all still going the same direction. Be it that rock was supposed to have shot out from the middle and moved several miles and splat. And I asked them at a conference, I said, how do you explain that? As a structural geologist, how do you explain that these things didn't even get twisted and distorted? And they just looked at me and blinked. And I kept pressuring them. How do you explain that? You just told me that this is what you found. How do you explain that? Why didn't these things get twisted around and all distorted? No, you're saying all the pre-impact fractures are still in the same orientation. They kept blinking, and they never addressed that in their papers. That was at a GSA conference, and I don't know, back before COVID. Wasn't that long ago. So, when you ask them questions and put their really kind of pressure them a little bit. I wasn't doing that as a creationist. I was just as a structural geologist. To me, that didn't make any sense. But number one, Chicxulub, there's no crater.
Wow.
Number 2, there's not enough melt. Number 3, there's not enough iridium. I've heard people say, well, the iridium blew away. But you go to one hill in Montana, there's iridium. You go to the next hill, there isn't. There's iridium throughout the rock record by volcanoes. And the volcanic eruptions, the subduction zone volcanoes are erupting all over the place. It's just... Yeah, I see this whole worldwide iridium. There's no worldwide iridium layer. There's worldwide iridium in a bunch of different layers. As I said, there's some places it's there, and the next hill it's not. And it's kind of hocus pocus because they're looking for it at this one level only. But it's below it, it's above it. There's iridium all over from volcanoes. Volcanoes can produce a lot of iridium.
So is this worldwide volcanism during the flood, basically?
Oh, yeah, the flood, you were peaking volcanic activity as you started to subduct even more and more. So I could actually show you on my graphs the different rock types, which I think I did in my first book. I can show you I kept track of the volcanic extrusions like lavas and ash as much as I could. And that peaks starts to really go up in the Absarica, the 4th megasequence, the 5th megasequence, the Zuni, when I think the flood peaked. And in the receding phase, that's when you see most of the volcanic activity was happening, and that's where you're seeing all the iridium being produced. But you can go around, if you want to believe it, you can go around, just look at the KPG boundary, the KT boundary, And oh, look, there's iridium here. But you can go to some hills, there's not there. Some places it is. But if you look above and below that, you're going to see layers of iridium too. But if we go to Chicxulub, their whole site down there where they say there's no crater. No crater, and there's almost no iridium. And they looked and looked up. These are all cored. Yeah, they find a volcanic intrusion. It used to be a volcanic intrusion. That's all it was. And I think that's all it really is, just an intrusion of magma that came in, which gives you that little bit of so-called melt that you do find in one or two wells. So
as creationists, should we then not say that there was a massive asteroid that hit during the flood? Is that unnecessary, basically?
I would say it's unnecessary. There were some impacts. Sure, there's one in Sweden, the Siljan crater, I think you say it. It's got flood rocks. There's actually a crater there you can see in the igneous, and there's a few flood rocks on the edges, early flood rocks. So there were some impacts, no doubt. But this impact to me is more hocus pocus than anything else. It's interesting. This particular one, there's other real craters, but this particular one, they find it at about the KPG boundary, but there's nothing there. There is no crater.
So they're overselling them. They're overselling.
Oh, yeah. They need a story. You got to. Why did the dinosaurs suddenly disappear in the rock record there? Well, to me, it's their whole ecosystem was wiped out. Boom. All their plants, all their animals they lived with, boom, they're wiped out. And then the water went out to the next ecological system, which is more the mammal ones and where the humans are probably living the highest elevation. And so that's these big changes in the Permian, Triassic, all that stuff is just boom, wipe out entire ecosystems. Boom. Next ecosystem, it's a wider one higher. It's a global phenomenon because the sea level goes up globally. If it's going to rise, it's not going to just rise in one area. That's one explanation for that whopper sand that they try to put forth is they said, well, the Gulf of Mexico dropped sea level 6,000 feet so the sand could get all the way out there and drop into this hole. But, if you drop sea level in the Gulf of Mexico 6,000 feet, it's going to have to drop worldwide 6,000 feet because it's all connected by groundwater flow. Everything's connected. People don't study groundwater enough. Groundwater shoots a lot of holes in a lot of evolutionary stories, like old oil. You just can't do things. People don't think about that. I wish I understood groundwater flow as well as I did when I worked for an oil and gas company, because oil has to move on the backs of the water to migrate from its source to its ultimate trap. But that trap's not going to last there for millions of years. So to me, the rocks don't tell you how old they are, but there's things in the rocks that do tell you these rocks are young. Good like point. The original tissues and dinosaurs, I want Howard and others to explain to me how you get, there's been over 130 papers now finding original proteins as deep as rocks, supposedly 500 million years ago in the Cambrian, worm proteins, all the way through the rock record. We see carbon-14 dates of diamonds we've sent off. They're supposed to be a billion years old or more. They come back with measurable carbon showing they're only thousands of years old. All these things, dinosaurs, carbon-14, the carbon-13 ratios are still valid. So you can't say it's contamination because why wouldn't the carbon-13 be altered? Carbon-13 still shows valid isotopes, which is a stable isotope. And I studied some of that in my grad school as well. Stable isotopes, a little bit more water. But the carbon-13, which they always measure with carbon-14, shows valid numbers. Then why would the carbon-14 be contamination, not the carbon-13? So there's big questions out there that people don't really look at. They don't ask because they're just buying into what they've been taught. And it's, for me, it was so easy to almost buy into it when I was in grad school working on my PhD, just to say, I give up. And trying to be a young earth creationist and keep your mouth shut. Because you're constantly being bombarded with the other side of the story. But when you really start looking at the data, like I had the chance to do the last 12 years, and look at Chicxulub area and all the cores drilled into there because I was working, that area of North America, trying to finish up and working in South America, it shows a completely different story than what the evolutionary community and the modern media just buys into it. And that's why they even made that movie 65, which again should have been 66. And so they would have made that movie and gone back in time. And
is that movie where he went back in time?
And it would have already happened. It wouldn't have happened yet. It would have, because it would have happened a million years before that. So it's like, they don't even.
I've seen Land Before Time, so I know that.
Yeah, I grew up on that. So the Slee Stack, and I believe that. No, it's it's science fiction stuff. So but it teaches sometimes a lot of bad things if you're not very careful.
That's right.
But the overall geology you get in these, GSA and these things that I get all the time, there's good science in there, but you got to kind of weave out extract it
Right.
from the interpretation.
Mhm.
You know, these idea of river channels, you know, in places that, and these are marine fish that are now deposited in Green River Formation, and they're saying, oh, those are all freshwater herring. But there's no freshwater herring today. There's no freshwater coelacanths today. Just because they're found with dinosaurs, they say, oh, these are freshwater sharks. These are freshwater coelacanths. These are, you know, herring. But, you know, you get this complete mixing of all these environments all the time. And that's exactly what you'd expect in a global flood. You know, waves coming in, bringing in marine critters, mixing them with the land animals and the coal seams. And, you know, why do you only see coal seams showing up pretty much at the same time all over the world? You know, why do you see dinosaurs only in certain layers? Why do you, you know, it's because that was the zone they were being buried in. They didn't stray far from their plants. They were designed to eat. And even today, alligators are still eating plants. Biologists dissect them and go, why are they still eating plants? Well, that was the original design. You know, God designed animals to eat just plants, including humans. But after the flood, a lot of these plants didn't proliferate. We now mostly have flowering plants, which are living at highest elevations because the climate's a lot different. God said you can eat animals, you can eat the meat. You know, animals can eat each other. They almost have to nowadays, the way you change the world. But it's very, very interesting. A lot of the things you're taught, just like Chicxulub, when you look at the facts, you know, even the shot quartz and all these different things are found in Indonesia in volcanoes. I mean, they're finding that same stuff because a lot of these magmas crystallize so quickly, coming up so fast that they shock their own magma chambers and create the shot quartz and iridium. And it's just amazing how, you know, volcanoes can explain most of the features we see at, you know, around the world in terms of its iridium. But there's not just one layer. You got to get that out of your head. There's not just one layer of iridium. And even that's not continuous. There's a lot of layers of iridium, and you just happen to be concentrating on the KPG boundary. The dinosaurs disappear and go, oh, look, this iridium's the same as over here. It's found in, you know, 100 places around the world. Well, there's another 10,000 places where it's not found at that level. They don't talk about that. And so show me the crater is what I say. The answer at all. Yeah. We got off on a good tangent here, but
no, that's great. That is another clip-worthy
as a
moment
geologist,
on a controversial issue.
Show me the crater, not just the gravity anomaly, because that's all they show you is a gravity anomaly, which is the most ambiguous geophysical data of all, because it can be made by so many things, deep density differences, shallow density differences. They all add together to give you that signal we're measuring. And so it just tells you there's something weird going on there, a couple of overlapping things. And so to me, you know, it's a great time to be a creation geologist, but we need more.
Amen.
You know, I'm getting old, getting up there. And so there's a few students I'm kind of keeping track of, and we need more people going into geology. But like Dwayne Gish told me when I heard him when I was an undergrad and stuff, he said, don't say anything. Don't tell people you're a creationist. Unfortunately, you can't, or you may never get your graduate degrees, because graduate degrees are subjective. So you do all the research, do all the work, but it's not just like taking classes. You've got to get through a dissertation or a thesis, you know, and you got to get through a committee, and they basically control whether you graduate or not. And, you know, I was one of the best students in my class, but I could have still flunked me out if they knew I was a, you know, blatant creationist at the time. So I didn't really go into the creation world per se until just before I came to ICR. You know, I was a young earth creationist, but I couldn't say anything. But it's been so wonderful to be able to come out and to pray at work and things I could never do in the, you know, corporate world or even in the public colleges. And it's just been wonderful since I came to ICR. I just, you know, ICR has been great to me and my family. It's just, you know, it's, you know, your people's prayers. And I hear stories from people that, you know, this book changed their life. There's a lot of Christian geologists that read through my Carbon Stone book with a little bit of an open mind, and they realized this is the book I wished I had earlier. This, you know, it's changed my life. And to me, those kinds of stories are so heartwarming that you wonder if I'm making a difference at all. And you know, I don't need to be, you know, patted on the back, and, you know, I'm not here for praise, but I'm so glad that Jesus is using some of the things I do, even though I make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and I try not to. But, you know, Jesus is using the work that's going out there, showing people that God's word is true. You can trust every bit of God's word, even the story about the flood, that there really is strong evidence geologically of a global flood, contrary to what some naysayers will say, like Hugh Ross. There's no evidence for that. No proper geologist, no well-trained geologist would say such things. He was a guy with no geology background to my
Right.
knowledge at all. He was, an astronomer, and a lot of his geology he's relying on others. And unless you're really into it and really know the ins and outs of it, and that's what the advantage of getting a graduate degree does. It makes you really do some problem solving, trying to come up with your research. And so there is value in the PhD, although I'd never do it again. Once is enough. It's like my one marathon. I got a medal over there somewhere for a marathon. Never do that again.
You did it once and you can cross it off the bucket list.
That's it. But his PhD is the same way. I would never get a second one. There's a lot of work. It was worth it. But, I'm so glad that the Lord is using me in spite of my sinfulness, my sinful past, to get me to this point. All the things in my, working for a company, seeing all these rocks, going on those field trips, digging dinosaurs and doing all these things as, as a university professor and stuff. All this, even sinful Tim can be used to do things that are making an impact on people's lives out there. And that's what I think is the greatest legacy that I can do, is pass on, is here's what the rocks show around the world. How do you explain this other than a global catastrophe? And realistically, how do you explain this? Then you have to go back in the world, and everybody, evolutionists, they just go back to, well, we explain all the way over millions and millions of years. But where's the evidence between the rock layers, of the erosion between the layers, and all these things? Just think about that. Keep an open mind. I don't want to argue. I don't have all the answers. Like tonight, I struggled. I like to see these, these sand channels, these river channels that are supposedly all over the Morrison. I've seen the Morrison in a lot of places. Did a lot of field work, and I haven't seen much in the way of sand channels or river channels anywhere. It's just pretty much clay layers, the same colors, the same bands, the same chert layer that goes, great distances around state after state after state, according to the USGS. But again, to me, everything is best explained by a global flood that happened 4,500 years ago, just like the Bible describes.
Amen. Good science affirms good scripture. And I can say that your work, this interview, your book behind me has really strengthened my faith.
Well, amen, brother.
You're a blessing, brother. You got a great reward. I appreciate this. I've really enjoyed watching you tackle a lot of these criticisms and challenges.
Those are good questions. I mean, they were really good ones. I appreciate the people that are willing to listen and to offer those as well. I mean, I may not have answered them the way they wanted, and sometimes maybe I sidestepped a little too much. But yeah, I want to see these things before they just say, well, there's all sorts of rivers. Well, there's all, even in the publications, I haven't seen. They interpret it as a river system that slowly migrate over millions of years, but I haven't really seen the river channels as much as he says. And maybe I'm wrong, but I'd like to see them.
I'm curious, Dr. Clarey, as we start to wind down here, because this question came in a few times, and I'm unfamiliar with this place.
Okay.
Are you? This comes in from Scriptures and Stones. Are you familiar with?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Southern Alakajan. Yeah.
Is it a challenge for us or something like
that?
Well,
it's really thick. There's this big zone where you have all these rocks. If I remember right, there's a huge thickness that kind of runs. I think it's the Ardmore Basin. I used to work that when I first started with Chevron. We were kind of working that area, and so there's this big fracture that opened up. It's kind of a rift that I think opened up, and it's kind of a triangle zone. If I remember right, we have three different. You have two of the continents broke apart and collided and kind of started to rift, just like the mid-continent rift in Michigan that runs around, wraps around Lake Superior and stuff. There's a big rift zone that never turned into a whole plate. Didn't produce enough. It stopped. And the Oklahoma-Wakajan kind of did the same thing. It was a sort of a spoke or a spur that kind of stuck off from two that did break away, as North America broke away from the Yucatan pulled away, but also from Africa. And so there was a big breaking that took place along there, but it went up the East Coast and broke North America from Africa during the flood. And that happened a little earlier than South America and Africa split. But that was one piece that kind of broke in, that kind of was almost like the third spoke of the wheel that never developed. It opened up a big crack. A lot of rocks dumped into it. So it's really deep and thick, but it never made a plate boundary. And that's what the mid-continent rift in Michigan did. It opened up, I believe, early in the flood, some of the earliest things. Even though evolutionists say it's 1 billion years old, I think it's some of the earliest flood cracks open with a lot of volcanic activity, sometimes miles thick of lava. And those rock got tilted up in the Keweenaw and got filled with copper, and we mined pure copper there in Michigan for many, many years. one of the few places you get pure copper, not a copper ore that's mixed with other things. And so that was a big source for the Bronze Age. I think they used copper like that, those deposits, to make bronze. But they might have been sailing over here well before Columbus came over here to get that. There's huge pits in Isle Royal where they dated them, and I believe some of the carbon-14 dates can be somewhat valid, and these are dated as about right after the flood would have happened, right after the Ice Age, and people might have been sailing around and then they forgot. But they were getting, I think there's a boat I read about it sank near Cyprus. It's about 2000 BC or so, and it's 90% copper, pure copper. From the only place you get that really is from Michigan, and 10% tin, which is the recipe for bronze. And so there's a lot of weird things, but I think that the Antarctic Basin failed rift is what they basically what it is. It's is Africa. You see a lot of these little rifts, but most of them are very small along South America. Even when I say South America and Africa, you see little rifts where the continents broke apart, but sort of diagonal, perpendicular to that, you see little rifts cutting in. They were breaking, so it didn't break just a simple line. There was several fractures that broke apart, and the Oklahoma Alakagen, or the Antarctic Basin, kind of is probably one of those. Just a big rift that never opened up to make a continent because it broke away somewhere else. So, for those of you that have no idea what we're talking about, it's best to see it on a map. But there's a lot of rifts where the continents broke apart, and so you see rifts that cut into the continent that never got too big. They just got deep and narrow, and that's what this is. So I think it can be explained away in the flood model as just a fracture that formed at the same time the continents are breaking.
It's basically a fracture from the catastrophic continental breakup during.
Essentially, it's just there some fractures. You broke three spokes at 60-degree angles or whatever to each other, or not, I guess would be more than that. And so you basically have three going like a triple junction, three different angles, and then two of them actually moved and left this one here. And so if you have three spokes coming off, I can't do math. I was really good at math. I got a math minor, but it's hard to do it when you're like when you're talking on the chalkboard. But you get three of them essentially equally spaced, and then two of them moved and became a new continent, and you left the one here going into Oklahoma. And I think that's I think it's a big problem for hydroplate theory. I'm not a big fan of hydroplate theory, so let's just leave it at that. I think catastrophic plate tectonics explains the mechanism of the flood is the best mechanism that I've come across, and it's validated by, again, those rocks in Alaska that show runaway subduction, the rocks in the deep earth. The subduction really did happen, and it happened quickly and recently. So hydroplate doesn't. I don't want to talk about that. I respect those guys. I love them. They're many of them are Christian brothers, but I think they need to put that aside and move on to a better theory, which today I think is John Baumgartner's catastrophic plate tectonics is the best mechanism of the flood.
So what might be one challenge to one flood model is not necessarily a challenge to another one. For example,
Correct.
I think you answered that,
Correct.
challenge pretty good.
I didn't know that's where they're coming from, but that's true. I mean, the hydroplate theory guys say there was 60 miles of granite that a lot of it blew into space and made the asteroids. Well, there was just a paper published by a young creation geologist, a friend of mine, that showed that these, the asteroids are not granite. They're, the more the heavier, mafic rocks, rich in iron and magnesium. They're more like a basalt. And so that you can't just say it all blew away and became the asteroids. It's the wrong chemistry. And so there's some issues with that.
Interesting.
They need to update. But those guys, they're very committed to that. I don't know why they're mostly engineers, because Walt Brown was an engineer. And so, but if you have a lot of geology training, and Andrew Snell and I both have struggled with, trying to explain to these guys that it doesn't fit the geology we're seeing, particularly all the new seismic tomography and things like that. And so it's another whole topic in itself. But I do, I respect where they're coming from. I just think that they've got a lot of things wrong.
Well, I find the evidence. Yeah, well, I find the evidence that you've presented, the confirmed expectations as well for CPT to be very compelling and very impressive. There's a lot of explanatory power. And I'm curious,
Mhm.
Dr. Clarey, before I let you go, I really appreciate your endurance. I wanted to say, I like the fact that you have a lot of knowledge, but you also
Mhm.
talk fast, because in 2.5 hours, you're
You
basically
can
able
slow me
to address
down.
everything.
Yeah, you can slow me down a little bit. Play it
No,
slower.
I personally like it, because you're able to address, 10
Well,
different
I'm
questions in
a
one.
little ADHD, and my wife will tell you that. She's a kindergarten teacher for many years. She's my gem that God gave me as a present.
Yeah,
But
amen.
she basically says, you have ADHD. I'm like, huh, interesting. Never heard of that when I was in school.
Well, it
Yeah,
works for these podcasts, because
mhm.
even in
We
your
jump
one
around a
answer
little bit.
earlier,
Mhm.
you're able
Mhm.
to debunk
Jump to another
isochron
subject.
dating.
Yeah,
We've able to,
yeah,
address so
yeah.
much here that the
Well,
critics like
and
to bring up.
unfortunately, I wish I could get into more details on some of these, but again, a lot of the problems with age dating is they don't understand groundwater flow. Everything is being flushed all the time, constantly. So you're telling me this rock right here been there for millions or billions of years, and it's still, you can tell what was there originally and what's there now. I mean, there's constant flushing. 50 feet per year, 15 meters per year is the average groundwater flow rate. So there's no closed system. There's nothing that doesn't leak in the natural world. Everything leaks, so we can't dispose of stuff. It's, as I mentioned earlier. So to me, there's so many unanswered questions, but unfortunately, the evolutionary community has the microphone. They say what they want. They
Right.
they get to say the way they want to say it, and they don't bring up the things they can't explain. And they just teach things like just, we have all the answers. You question us, you're some crazy creationist. As soon as I joined ICR, I became a non-scientist in the minds of most people. But I'm doing the greatest science, the greatest research I've ever done in my life. And even my critics say, "Well, we love your data, we just don't like your interpretation." But I challenge them: how do you interpret this any other way besides a global catastrophe, when everything does the same thing on every continent at the same time, bearing the same critters, at the same levels, all over the world in the same order, making a global geologic column, which again, some creationists, we can't have that. It's evolutionary. It's because it was a global flood. And so it really does work. It makes a lot of sense. So not everything the evolutionary community comes up with is bad science. A lot of it's really good. It's just the interpretation that they do as well
Interpretation.
that I disagree with. And so to me, the more data I find, the more, though, the data is screaming global flood, every continent. So soon I'll have Antarctica. I'll add it to the mix.
That's going to be great.
I only know about 10% of it because most of it's covered in ice. So it's, but there's data there that matches up with the other continents. So we'll see how it comes out.
Well, could you imagine if we had as many researchers as they do in the secularist world?
Oh, yeah.
The government grants, the billions of dollars of funding,
Mhm.
because just with what you and a few awesome, men of God, geologists in the young earth creationist world are doing, look at all this data just with a few minds.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, God definitely has given us wisdom. I pray for wisdom a lot, even though I'm just a sinner saved by grace, he's able to use me. And some of this is, paying dividends to people. The evolutionists that say, well, you're teaching them bad science, but I'm showing them what the science really shows. This is what the rocks really show. These are the rocks that are still there. Someone else could do the same study and spend 10 years, 15 years of life doing this, and they get almost the same answers because it's the same rocks that are there. But the only way I can see to explain this is a global flood. And when I started this, I'll be honest, I believed there was a global flood. And I started, when I started the columns, I'm like, I sure hope the columns show a global flood. I was had a little bit of moment of doubt there. I'm like, let's plot it up and see what happens. And as I finished up a continent, and I went to another continent, I'm like, they're showing the same thing.
Wow.
So I had my moment of doubt as well, thinking, well, let's just follow the data and see what happens. And the data is just screaming global flood. So I praise God that he's, able to use me, and thankful to him as my Lord and Savior, that I just so thankful that he called me to him, and he called me to do this job in spite of me, in spite of, sinful things I've done in my past to get me to this point. He's still able to use the skills I've acquired over the years. And so it's never too late for years I struggled with, I didn't know what, I knew there was something that God wanted me to do, but I didn't know what that plan was. And it wasn't until I was 52, 12, almost 13 years ago now, that I realized this was God's plan. This is where he wanted me to be. In spite of me, he still brought me through it all. It's just like, I just tell people, I'm glad I wasn't 80 like Moses. I'm glad I didn't actually have to physically kill somebody, but I've done, I've broken the 10 commandments by breaking one. I've broken a bunch of them.
Right.
I'm not proud of that at all. But the Lord can forgive me for all that. And I try to try not to. We try to, live as holy lives as we can, but we're still in that unholy flesh.
Right.
It's a constant battle.
Who shall deliver me from the body of this death? As Paul said.
Exactly. So, but the Lord Jesus will.
Amen. Praise the Lord. All things work together for good to them that love God and to them that are called according to his purpose. And clearly, Brother Tim, Dr. Clarey, you followed the path that he has laid out for you. And because of that, you've been a blessing to so many. So I appreciate all you've done. I think we titled this correctly. The Genesis flood was real. A geologist reveals shocking evidence, because I've been a Young Earth Creationist for a while, and I'm still blown away more and more every single day, as it truly is an honor to get to have these discussions with so many great researchers like yourself, Dr. Clarey.
You get to talk to a lot of them. Yeah, I see them at the conferences, but yeah, you got a great job too, Donny. So I really appreciate you having me on, helping, getting the word about ICR out there. Sometimes we're the best kept secret in the creation community for some reason, but we're doing the research. We're doing the biology research showing that natural selection is not the right mechanism. It's God built in the animals. He built in the cave fish the ability to adapt and lose their eyes, and that's why every animal goes into the cave. They all do the same thing. They all lose their skin color and they all lose their eyes. You'd think maybe just one species would, but no, they all do. Everything that goes in there, after so many generations, which we're trying to find out, how long does it really take? And that's what we're actively working on. That we think Darwin pulled a fast one on everybody. Dr. Galuza says he basically stuck in natural selection in place of God, and so he thinks nature can select, but nature can't select. Right. Only the DNA inside the animal or the plant can adjust itself to, like epigenetics. It turns on certain things, turns off certain things depending on the environment it finds itself in. So it senses the environment and is able to adjust accordingly. But nothing's really evolving. It's just, the cave fish are still the same DNA. They're just different morphotypes of each other.
Is it different expression?
Right, different expression. That's basically it. And so they change. And just like the finches that Darwin talked about, they're the same species of finch. They're just different morphotypes. Their beaks change within a generation or two, if I recall, just depending on what they're eating. Right. And they'll pass that to the next generation, the bigger beak or a smaller beak, but they're still essentially the same species. But evolutionists call them morphotypes. They try to say they're different species, but they're not. They can interbreed. That's the definition of a species, according to most biologists. Mm-hmm. And so it's, there's really no example out there in the biological world of any evolution of anything changing to something new. It's just a new strain of viruses. There's still viruses and new bacteria. Fish blind, whether they're blind and sightless or have no pigmentation or not, the DNA doesn't really change. Just a matter of what's some certain switches that are going on and off, and we're trying to figure out what that is.
With all of those millions of switches then going on and off, does that mean we have an accessible answer to the objection, Dr. Clarey, where people say, oh, there's no way you can get all these different variations in 4,500 years since the flood? But
even sooner, I think, than that. Some of these can happen. We're finding even the evolutionary studies, Dr. G's been watching for 20 years, and he says we've been doing it wrong. It's all in the DNA. These animals can adapt within a generation or two, within a few generations. Many of these adaptations, and they're programmed, they're repeatable. They're not random mutations. These are programmed adaptations that even the evolutionists are finding that these things will happen again and again. And you put these animals in the same conditions, same environment, they're going to adapt to that. And that's so, God knew after the flood, the world's going to be a lot different. It wasn't going to be a global greenhouse anymore. Mm-hmm. You're going to have deserts. You're going to have really cold regions. And you're going to have animals that can fill the earth. You're going to have animals that can adapt. And he built that in from the day he created them, the day of creation. In that DNA, our DNA is so complex. The more we find out about it, the more complex it is. There's different levels and different levels and different levels. And the geneticists, like my colleague, Dr. Jeff Tompkins, it's the new information just blows those guys away. There's so much information that we don't even understand. We're just scratching the surface of that. But we can, that can happen very quickly within generations. You can go from an animal that can live in, a nice, perfect climate like Hawaii, and within a few generations, they can be put in a desert and drier as the climate got drier and drier and drier after the flood. Egypt was well watered, like the Bible says, for a long time because there was so much rain from all the hot water coming down that there was no desert there. But even humans adapted to use more and more of the Nile, and just relying on the Nile now instead of It was lush vegetation everywhere. The Bible even tells us that when Lot and Abraham are looking out there, God throws in the end of that verse, he says, and Egypt was well watered at the time. And so for well over 1,000 years or maybe more after the flood, you had a lot of more rainfall than you have now. And there weren't really deserts until the last probably couple thousand years before the Sahara became a big desert. And these areas became so dry and desolate. And God talks about that. He basically cursed some of these places for being, hard on Israel, that they're going to become a desolate wasteland. And maybe that's some of that, but he knew that was all going to happen. And so but the animals living out there, certain animals could adapt to that he pre-programmed in there to fill those little niches and environments. So we see animals everywhere. They can, live in extremely dry areas, really cold areas, but, over multiple generations, they're able to adapt that way. But it's not random. It's programmed that God built into the system. So we give our reason for the adaptations and stuff. We give it back to the ultimate designer, the ultimate engineer, Jesus, who built all this into these animals.
Those forward-thinking mechanisms you're speaking about point us right back to the forward thinker who front-loaded the biological world with that adaptability. So I think that's
exactly, yeah.
Dr. Clarey, this has been excellent. I could ask you questions for the next 10 hours. Looks like we got a commenter saying ICR made it to 1 million subscribers.
Yeah,
wow.
we did. I think that's true. Yeah, we were at 900,000 a while ago, and that's pretty good. I'm glad. Thank you if you're a subscriber. A lot of it's free. We put this out there free. You can pay and get some stuff ahead of time, get a few extra things, but we're more than happy to just have the people sign up for free. And our Acts and Facts is free. Our magazine we've been putting out since 1970. It's got a lot bigger, a lot nicer. This is the newest issue. It's coming out in your mailbox soon.
It'll be at my local church soon then.
If you haven't found out, that you can get electronically too. So you just go to icr.org and you can sign up for that. But that's got a lot of good articles in there. This one, I'm talking about Dinosaur Ridge up in Colorado. So it's a little bit about the Morrison Formation and all these dinosaur footprints and things in here. Here's the
put you full screen. So
the Morrison Formation right here. So, and to me, that's
great.
Big.
Well, there we go, Howard. I got to make sure Howard gets one of those magazines.
Okay. Yeah, he needs to sign up. It's free. We won't tell anybody, Howard.
You can't beat that. Free. I mean, it doesn't get into that right
well,
there.
Enough. I get enough donors give to ICR that we can give that away free for the last since 1970. But so
I guess we got it right here. ICR Acts and Facts. ICR magazines.
Yeah, you have good people.
So many good books. I've got Dr. Tompkins one behind me there.
Yeah.
Human Chimps. Here's over here, carved in stone.
Yeah, he's got one on flood geology or the fossil record. Here it is. The fossils say no. This is Dr. Tompkins. He collaborated, but this is his book.
I got to get that one.
The fossils still say no. And so I can send you a copy of this too, Howard. But this is by Jeff Tompkins. He basically took my mega sequences and tied all the fossils to it, which fossils are found in certain layers and why. So the question you asked earlier, but I'll email me, remind me to send you the fossil book and the new textbook for Liberty. I'll send you a copy of each of those.
Wow, that's awesome.
It
feels like Christmas morning.
Well, it will be. You'll probably get it.
So that book complements your carved in stone well, then you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of. It's thinner, but it's a compilation of Acts and Facts articles he wrote, but he added a little bit to it. So it's really well done. He's pretty proud of it. So we gave a talk at ICC on that even.
Well, here it is.
But if you can't afford the book,
don't say no.
Yeah.
For people to check out.
So if you can't afford the book, you can always go to the ICC ninth proceedings of the 9th International Conference on Creationism, and you can find his article that way. At least an article that explains some of this a little bit better. Yeah, a little more technical, but it's still there.
And you've published your mega sequence research up to this point. I know next year or so you're going to be working at Antarctica, but you've presented those at the ICC, and there's papers.
Right. The last 2023, I presented 5 continents that I had done at the time. So I show my progressive flood model, and that's free. That paper is free. I think we have a link to it even at our website, ICR. But you can go to the proceedings of the 9th Annual International Conference on Creationism. You can find my paper with myself and Davis J. Warner, my student assistant, which basically is the 5 continents of data, global flood model based on 5 continents of data. So it's pretty. I have one more continent done since then. I finished Australia and New Zealand in that area, and now I've just finished Antarctica. So the second book will actually be cover 4 continents. It'll be a second volume. I won't cover the first 3 continents again, but I'll give some global musings, shall we say, completely global stuff. Because now they have the whole world done. We're going to find some more interesting patterns that are going to show up. So the next book, next big thick book I do, maybe it won't be quite as thick, but we'll try to get a lot of the data in there to show people here's the data, and here's why we interpret it this way, and this is why. So,
well, that is a sequel I am looking forward to, Dr. Clarey. So my prayers will be with you.
Thank you. Yeah,
in your research.
Yeah. Well, we get a lot of attacks, spiritual attacks, and people just saying we're bunch of buffoons and we're not scientists and all this stuff, but yet we find ourselves doing some of the best science out there, even I think a lot better even than a lot of the evolutionary scientists are doing, because they don't think the way we do.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
They're not looking at all the continents and plotting data. They're not doing that stuff, but we are. So we're trying to, because I was a little worried initially, but I realize now that, wow, after a couple of continents, boy, does this show a global flood. So.
And I love how you said earlier that you went in with a little bit of doubt, and yet you came out confirming exactly, and you came in realizing that the geological evidence, the scientific data confirms what I believe the Bible teaches about the flood.
Yeah, but we don't have to blindly accept it though. There is data to back it up, but we need a little bit of faith. Just a mustard seed. That's all we need. To move mountains.
That's why the Bible says to grow in faith, add to your faith, and I think we do that.
I think this does. Yeah, this should help a lot of people, I hope.
And the Bible says all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. So if you guys are getting some criticism like we get here at Standing for Truth,
I'm sure you get the same stuff.
Greater reward in that.
Yeah. Well, that's I agree. But, I'm just thankful that the Lord has blessed me with what He has and the work I'm able to do, and to be able to tell people like yourselves and your audience. And to me, it's a blessing to share this with people. I know it's like a garden, like a fire hydrant, or what they say, a fire hose coming at you sometimes, but it was there's a lot of information in there that I'm glad we're able to cover a few different things.
Well, to me, it makes it more rewatchable, because I'm already looking forward to tonight rewatching it and digesting all the information that you've offered us, Dr. Clarey. And so is there any final words, final thoughts, anything you wanted to leave myself and the audience with that perhaps you haven't said yet, or just something you want to reiterate?
Well, one, I guess, the Bible is true, and everything in it is true. God's word is true. And the Bible is really a love story. It shows a lot of imperfect humans sinning, myself included, not in the Bible, but my life has been that. But yet God is still able to use those people to reach His ends that He has planned all along. He's able to use imperfect people. Everybody in the Bible sinned except for Jesus, but He came as the Lamb, and He shed His blood to take away our sins, took our place. And so I want people to know that they can get salvation. They can get joy, they can get happiness through Jesus. And that's really what, all the work we do at ICR, we want to point people to Jesus. But you first got to believe God's word is true. And then you can believe that there really was a Jesus, and that Jesus really did do these things. And, He's calling to you. You just have to open the door and let Him in.
Amen. Well said. Salvation, joy, and happiness through Jesus Christ, our Savior. And again, it
doesn't mean your life's going to be perfect. You're going to have a lot of problems.
That's right.
But you've got Jesus to get you through those problems. And so
amen. We got Jesus. We can lean on. We can cast our cares and anxieties and fears.
Amen.
On Him.
Yes.
Okay, brother. This has been so good. Time has flown by with you. As I said in the intro, this would be packed with information, highly informative, eye-opening. And so I want to thank everybody in the live chat, our critics, our non-critics. I really appreciate all the comments, the feedback, the challenges that have come in. Dr. Clarey, you did an excellent job answering those. I had a lot of fun watching you engage and interact with those technical questions.
Some of those were tough. Some of those are tough. Some of them we got to go out there and look.
Well, you did a great job.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Dr. Clarey, God bless you. This has been a blessing.
God bless you all. All your listeners, God bless you all.
God bless.
Merry Christmas.
And Standing for Truth, Merry Christmas. Yes. And Dr. Clarey and I are signing off. God bless all.